In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. What is the kingdom of God? That's heaven. That's what's being described here. Heaven is a time. You don't become one flesh with someone by having sex with them. Is that two people having a child together does literally make two people one spirit.
That makes a
flesh.
lot more sense. Yeah.
What is being talked about here isn't sex. It's the creation of a new person. That just, like, when I read it with the Techno-Puritan framing, it makes so much sense to me. When I read it with traditional Christian framing, it makes a bunch of weird claims where you need to like get all metaphorical and everything. And yeah,
it feels like you're bending over backward to make it work. And this is just correct. It just seems correct. Of course.
Real worship is not done through masturbating emotional states. Even if they include feelings of grandeur and awe, they are still basal emotions. Of course, they feel good. That is what masturbation does. It makes you feel good. That is not a sign that it is good. As a side note here, people will use the story of the gold used in the tabernacle from Exodus as an excuse to worship in luridly decorated buildings. However, it is important to remember that we believe some polytheistic stories and tales worked their way into the religious texts like the Bible, especially when you're talking about older texts like Exodus, but that God loudly and explicitly marks where this has happened, so anyone paying even the littlest bit of attention will notice. What's being done in this tabernacle? Imagine you go up to a place of worship and you saw this ceremony being carried out. Quote, "He must kill the young bull, and priests must bring its blood and sprinkle it on all sides of the altar. It must be a dove or young pigeon. The priest will bring it to the altar and pull off its head, which he will burn on the altar. The bird's blood must be drained out the side of the altar. Then he must tear the bird open by its wings," end quote. It is not like any of this is subtle. But it does mean that God expects you to actually be paying attention when you read it and use the smallest amount of discretion when doing so. It's like someone saw that scene. And they walk away and they go, yeah, that was definitely a bunch of good Christians. That's what this story is meant to teach us, is what Baalite worship looks like. That this Baalite sin transference ritual doesn't work is also recorded for us in the Bible. If it did work, both Moses and the other Israelites would have been able to go into the promised land. When I look at Christians who pray to a god of precious metals and animal sacrifices, the god that gets off to humans ripping apart birds as an act of worship, I am reminded of...
All will be well, and you will know the name of God, the one true God. Behema-koitl.
Behema what?
Behema-koitl. He's here. He's everywhere. Come.
He's talking about a bug.
He thinks God is a bug?
He's got religion.
Maybe we should kill him.
Why? Because he believes in God like you.
It's the wrong God!
Would you like to know more?
Hello, Simone. We're going to be doing another Tract episode. For people who are new watchers and not familiar with these, we mark them with a different color gear logo, just so you know that you're going to get into some real weirdness. It's on our personal religious beliefs and re-engaging with the Abrahamic tradition for us and finding an iteration of it that I think is true. And you can think of it like an outline for another denomination of Christianity that we call Techno-Puritanism. And I'm just going to jump right in because I like that. I like the active theological conversation, but there's also some risk to that because when you're having an active theological conversation about what you believe, that really opens you up to criticism and can make you look kind of foolish, especially if it includes, well, any sort of religious component, right? If you don't have a big community to back you and you say something like, oh, well, this guy was walking on water, people are like, oh, you must be in a cult, you know?
So as Nigel says in the opening scene of The Devil Wears Prada.
All right, everyone, gird your loins.
Did someone eat an onion bagel?
All right. How do Techno-Puritans define good? Although this one could also be called the New Covenant. I saved this tract for later because I suspect it is going to anger more people than our other tracts, both because it has much more radical reinterpretations of classical biblical stories than we have gone into before this, like the tabernacle as well as Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and it regards sin and telling people that they are sinners, which is never popular. But as Galatians 1:10 says, "For do I now persuade men or God? Or do I need to please men? For if I pleased men, I should not be the servant of Christ." Modern Christians have narrowed their concept of sin by focusing on the sins of others that cause disgust in them. They say that person has gay sex, that's a sin, and that person masturbates, that's a sin. And it's like, yes, that is true, but you should be more focused on your own sins than those of others. What does the Bible tell us about how we should live our lives? Let's go over a few lines here. Corinthians 10:31 instructs, "Whether therefore you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God," end quote. Corinthians 5:10, which states, "And he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and was raised again." Galatians 3:23 states, "And whatsoever ye do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not unto men." Romans 14:23, "But if you have doubts about whether or not you should eat something, you are sinning if you go ahead and do it, for you are not following your convictions. If you do anything you believe is not right, you are sinning." The Bible is pretty clear about what is sin. Sin is anything you do not for God, whether that's listening to music, watching a sports game, playing video games, looking at art, or gay sex. If your response to this is, "But no one can live a sinless life," then congratulations, you just found out you're not a god. In this tract, we will focus on Techno-Puritans' conceptions of good and evil. But before we talk about what I think the traditional interpretations of Christianity get wrong about sin, let's talk about what broader society thinks about good and evil and how it got there. So what are your thoughts so far on like what the Bible says sin is? Does that sound right to you? Or
I mean, I like the focus, at least in the quotes provided, on the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law. Though I imagine that there's plenty in the Bible that could probably shove people toward the letter of the law instead. You know how people select things from the Bible very advantageously toward their goals.
I think you are right, but I also think clearly and repeatedly throughout the Bible, as I have shown here, it states sin is anything you do not for God. So while there's a bunch of specific rules that are mentioned in the Bible, I'll go over why I don't think those are as relevant in modern times. And this broader, stricter definition of sin is probably right. But then you need to consider, which we'll go into later in this, well, if you're doing it for God, what does that mean? Like, what is the nature of God? How do you know you're not doing it for a false God, right? So now we're going to go into the way sin is conceptualized in secular society.
Well, I would just add, though, I really love that passage about if you think a food isn't right to eat, then don't eat it. Like if you, I think let's just
your convictions.
Yeah. Let's put it this way. Sinning, I think, is a lot like porn. You know it when you see it. So if you're like, this seems a little sinful, it probably is. And so
what is sinful can differ between individuals, and that line shows that, because not everyone's going to have the same reaction to something. And I think that the strength of your reaction to something is correlated to your individual susceptibility to that form of sin. When I talk about susceptibility to a form of sin, it's how much is that sin going to pull you away from God. And so you think of something like drinking, right? Like, to one individual, drinking might not be much of a sin at all because they can drink and it doesn't affect their ability to work or to worship or anything like that. Right. Another person, they engage a little bit with a drink and now all of a sudden it's the entire focus of their life. Yeah. Or it's the same thing with certain types of sexuality. Some people can engage with it without consuming their entire lives. And for them, it's less of a sin. While for other people, it's more of a sin because of the temptation involved in it for them.
Like pain, sin is very context dependent.
Yes. All right. To your average member of society, good and evil are determined by what, if widely believed, would help the average person maximize their own emotional state, e.g. general utilitarianism. However, general utilitarianism, maximally distributing positive emotional states among humans, is on its face stupid. As those emotional states are just the things that, when felt in response to certain environmental stimuli, led to some of our ancestors having more surviving offspring than others. They are things that we were serendipitously pre-coded to react to based on environmental conditions that haven't existed for thousands of years. As we have said ad nauseum, humans coming up with a utilitarian value system is like a society of paperclip maximizers coming together and building an ethical system based on the number of paperclips in the world. Your programming is just that, your programming, not a sign of intrinsic value. However, society does not tell us that utilitarianism is a politically correct value system to signal because most people genuinely hold it as their value system. It chooses to follow it because most people are, at their core, hedonists. And when you ask a hedonist what you should value, it is in their best interest to tell you not to be a hedonist, but to be a utilitarian. The secular world is a world of hedonists trying to maximize a combination of their emotional state and their self-perception as a good, high-status person, all while trying to reduce any in-the-moment suffering. However, because perceived status and being a good person are in part determined by an individual's ability to loudly signal they hold a utilitarian value set, the secular world has become a world of hedonists constantly signaling to each other that they are utilitarians. It's a pathetic masquerade. All right.
Yeah, checks out.
Consequentialist ethical systems are those systems interested in the consequences of one's actions with some goal in mind. Deontological ethical systems are those based around a set of rules. In a broader sense, deontological ethical systems are kind of dumb. Quote, lying / stealing / cheating are bad and always evil, end quote. Quote, okay, well, what if someone has a gun to a kid's head and will shoot if you don't lie / cheat / steal, end quote. Almost every deontologist I know caves in this scenario about what the right thing to do is, because they are really consequentialists who are just using deontological systems to make daily decisions. So while it is dumb to believe deontological systems are absolutely right or wrong, it is actually quite smart to build a deontological system to follow for your daily life. And it is easier to create a set of rules about right and wrong than thinking through the long-term consequences of every little decision you make. This is especially true if you are of average or below average intelligence. Thus, at the level of a population, it would always make sense for God to reveal deontological ethical systems, especially to the philosophically less sophisticated man that existed thousands of years ago. If God was operating on a consequentialist ethical system, he would have revealed varying deontological value systems to early man tailored to that iteration of man's time and context. This is exactly what he did. Most of the true Abrahamic traditions have a collection of varying deontological ethical frameworks given to them by God based on their time, technology, and social circumstances. This is why many of the true revelations of God have prescriptions around things like slave treatment, even though we know that owning slaves is wrong. In a world where slavery was the norm, God was able to ensure more mass good action for his people by giving specific prescriptions on how to treat slaves than outright banning slave ownership. Because if he had done that in the harsh reality of our ancestors, his people would have been outcompeted by their neighbors. However, we can clearly see that God is not a deontologist through the fact that the deontological ethical systems he gifted man across time differ. If God was using these systems because they were his actual ethical framework, he would not have varied them, but if he was using them to drive specific consequentialist outcomes, then he would have. And let's be honest here, anyone who claims God really believed those earlier deontological value systems has to bite the bullet and admit that God thought slavery was a good or okay thing. So before I go further, do you have any thoughts?
I think about things analogously with children a lot. So when I think about deontological rule following sets, I think of parents saying, because I told you so. But then I also think about how that degrades really quickly with our children. If we just give them a rule and they don't know why the rule's there, they're just going to break it. And I kind of feel like that happens a lot. Sometimes with religions like Catholicism, there are rules that are almost expected to be broken, but then you just ask for forgiveness, but then just please keep following the rule and asking for forgiveness. And I just personally much prefer explaining to our children, for example, here's what's going to happen if you do this thing. Here's the consequence. Here's, in general, what we value and hoping that they'll make the right decision. But it doesn't always work. And I can understand why sometimes trying to explain to our children why, for example, like their safety or being nice to a sibling and learning how to share is important, because they're just not going to get it. So sometimes we just have to say, you have to do this thing because I said so right now. And they're just not going to be able to. They have to follow the letter of our law. And I feel as though you could say God is doing the same thing. Sometimes he wishes he could explain to us why something is in our better interest, but we just don't have the capacity at that time.
I completely agree with you. And for people who don't know how bad these deontological systems are within a modern time period, you can go to our Why Are Catholics Going Extinct video. But in that, you can see things like Catholics, which have strong religious prohibitions against things like terminating fetuses, use things like Plan B at almost the same rate as a secular person does, or non-Catholics do, and uses other types of contraception and abortion-related things at very similar rates to the secular world. So it just doesn't hold that well. I don't feel like this was true historically. I mean, if you look historically, like, and when I say even recent history, like 70s, 60s, these deontological value systems in Catholics really did keep them from using early contraceptive techniques and did keep their fertility rates really high. And I suspect that this is just an evolving society thing, in the same way that like kids mature over time and need different explanations for why they need to do something. If you're going to actually have them follow it, humanity has sort of grown up. And I think these deontological ethical systems are actually probably not hard for people of our distant past to follow. They're just hard for people of this era to follow, given our philosophical maturity and the level of information that we have access to. Just do it because X book says so isn't as strong a motivation for people anymore. And so it's not driving the outcome, so you talk about something like prohibitions on contraception. These are probably made to increase the number of kids people are having. And if you create arguments like, well, you're preventing a human being from coming into existence, that is a more powerful argument than because I said so these days.
Yeah. Well, I also think deontological systems, or following the letter of the law, really only works in societies where enforcement is very strong, either through social shaming or through like a caliphate that is capable of enforcing those values. When you can't enforce some kind of punishment for rule breaking,
I disagree here. I think non-community based enforcement weakens a religion over time. This is what we've seen in governments that try to enforce.
No, sure. Outsourcing is totally broken.
You need a person's community to do the shaming. So like when you get a divorce, you need nobody to want to marry someone who's gotten divorced before, and then people don't get divorced again. But if you create like government laws around this, people always find a way around it. I mean, that's what we learned from the Prohibition, right? Like you cannot enforce morality. And Prohibition's a great example of this, because it wasn't really a religious thing. Jesus turned water to wine. He's not intrinsically against alcohol. So this was the government trying to enforce morality, and it caused more immorality of the type it was trying to enforce.
But the point I'm making also is that when people don't understand the spirit of the law, they'll only follow the letter of the law if they know that they have to, if they're being punished very consistently and severely.
Well, socially punished in terms of status, not punished by a governing entity, because the punishment that people actually react to is status punishment. So for example, people didn't react to prohibition by drinking significantly less. They actually started drinking more, or at least the individuals who were susceptible to that individual sin. And we'll go over this in other sins where you see people actually doing it more when it's prohibited on a top-down level. But if drinking decreased the status of an individual, then they would stop drinking. People are very sensitive to community enforced status norms, which is what these deontological systems used to have on their side. And that armor has sort of been removed from humanity, and you need to figure out ways to enforce this yourself, even though following the rules may even hurt your status. Same with your kids. How do you pass this down to your kids when the rules that you're passing down to them may hurt their status? I.e., don't sleep around with a lot of girls while you're in high school. That's certainly going to lower a kid's status. How do you pass that down to them if that's an option for them?
How do you address the conundrum of erotic material consumption then in conservative states, for example, where it is shamed to consume?
But it's not shamed. It's not shamed because people don't know about it. It's a sin that someone can do in private, the top down. So what she's referring to, and we actually get this to this later in the tract, but if you look at the US, like which state consumes the most porn? Utah, the state with the highest prohibitions against pornography. Mormons are not supposed to masturbate at all. If you look by zip code and you look at the level of religiosity of zip code, you see more engagement with pornography in those districts. Why is this happening? I think it's because there isn't actually a social consequence to these people for masturbating. So that's another thing, is it can't be a sin that someone can do in private. I remember, in Muslim countries, one of the things I would always find like walking down the streets was like hidden hard alcohol bottles in like alcoves and stuff like that. It doesn't prevent somebody, social shaming around drinking doesn't prevent somebody from not drinking. It prevents them from not drinking at home. It prevents them from not going to bars to drink, right? Which may make it harder for them to drink overall. But the way people relate to sin, it's important to like psychologically understand this and build self-mastery over sin. But that's what a lot of this tract is going to focus on. All right. These systems were given to man to achieve some consequentialist outcome, but what? What is the thing we see in the communities around the world that followed one of God's true revelations? A period of technological and cultural flourishing. For more on this, see Tract 6. God's deontological ethical systems were gifted to man in order to help us intergenerationally expand humanity's potential. And I really want to note here that people can be like, no, God's about happiness, but those regions didn't really have more happiness than their neighbors. So that couldn't have been what he was motivating for. Or it's about peace, but those regions weren't more peaceful than their neighbors. So what did those regions have that their neighbors of other types of faith systems, incorrect faith systems, I believe, not have? It was unique periods of technological and cultural flourishing. However, now that we are under the new covenant, we are expected to accept responsibility for thinking through the consequences of our actions ourselves. What do we mean by the new covenant, and what signaled man's transition into it? We categorize God's revelation with man existing in 3 stages that we know of so far. These stages are: 1, primordial man. Biblically speaking, this is before man was cast out of the garden, which, as we go over in this video on the Garden of Eden, we believe to be a story about man building the first permanent settlements and ethical systems man created in opposition to God's ethics to govern those settlements. God did not really have a connection to man at this stage of history, given that we were too developmentally simplistic to understand him or intergenerationally transmit that understanding. 2, transitional man. Transitional man is marked by the quote-unquote curses God gave man as he transitioned into the age of settlements and early civilization. Having to work the land for food, pain in childbirth, and women existing beneath men / having an irrepressible attraction to men. Again, death was clearly not one of these curses. See Tract 6. God built very simplistic deontological frameworks to help the flourishing of civilization for this natal version of humans, and largely related to the transitional man in the way we now relate to children, as you were saying earlier. The religions God gave to this form of man are analogous to us giving our children stories of Santa. We see that these stories delight them and help teach them valuable lessons, but also that one day they are going to have to grow out of them. 3, realized man. Realized man is marked by a period after which God, through humanity's ingenuity, lifted the curses he placed on transitional man. In relieving these curses, he marked the coming of a new covenant and revealed that they were never in fact curses, but more like training wheels, as without them, most of humanity lacked the will to resist temptation and continue the species. Realized man is expected by God to seek understanding himself, rather than be told right from wrong, to keep himself disciplined without simplistic rules, and master his own nature without the assistance of fairy tales. In the transition from the era of primordial man to transitional man, many human groups were unable to make the leap. These groups were, to use a euphemism, outcompeted by transitional man, because transitional man was different from primordial man, as primordial man is different from the beasts. The same is true for realized man. When looking at youth deconversion rates to the urban monoculture, it is easy to see those who cling to the transitional frameworks as being like an overly sentimental captain going down with his ship. But this too is too harsh a reading. They are simply not like realized man. They are the bronze man in an iron world. Their traditions cannot save them from the temptations of the Valley of the Lotus Eaters. In the final stages of the transition from primordial man to transitional man, we were told a story of God sending a flood to clean the world of those not ready for the age, those too sinful for it. After this act, God promised he would never again genocide humanity in flood. And that is why the genocide we are living through represents a perfect inversion of the last. It is done not by God, but by man himself. In this cleansing of the earth, it is the unworthy themselves who, possessed by their own passions, do not drown, but march with lifeless eyes to burn in a bonfire of their own vanity. And this is one of the things that gets me. It's almost like, we're living in a society right now where people are like randomly running off and stabbing themselves in the neck with like scissors, genetically speaking, at least. It's like a world of mass suicide. It's like we're living through that movie, The Happening, where like everybody starts randomly killing themselves, and people like don't see this as like a cosmic or biblical event. They're like, oh yeah, this is normal. It makes sense for people to be like throwing themselves into genetic wood chippers right or left, and then the mainstream society being like, that's good, way to go. I mean, what do you like? Do you feel the weight of this period of history?
We don't. I think we can logically know it and not feel it. And this is along the lines of a very common human fallacy that I think is never discussed, which is that I think we feel the need to get permission or to get a very clear sign to do a lot of things now. If you keep talking about the demographic apocalypse, essentially, as it's going to play out, everyone is picturing Road Warrior. And what you're trying to tell everyone is that no, really what you can more expect is what South Africa is like today. These things will happen, or there could be an American Revolution or a complete failure of democracy, but it's not going to look like that. It's going to look like, elections sort of losing integrity, and we won't really know it necessarily. So I think what's happening is that we expect war, we expect mass death, we expect all sorts of crazy, dramatic things to be happening. We expect cinematic drama. And because we don't see it, we're assuming that, okay, well, the alarms haven't gone off. Like the fire alarm isn't going off, and therefore we don't need to take action. And this was something else, like when people are thinking about, should I have kids? Or when you and I were doing our search for a company and trying to decide what company to acquire, we expected someone to kind of come out of the bushes and say, yes, buy this one, as though one of our investors would say, yeah, go ahead, buy it. I think it's a good thing. Instead of them just saying, well, who else is invested? I don't know. What do you think? In the end, it is the responsibility of each individual person to recognize a threat or an opportunity or their capacity to take something on, and then to do it. And I think the biggest risk to many people, especially people with privileged backgrounds who are lucky enough to be born in developed nations like the United States, like many European countries, like many Asian countries all over the place now, the responsibility falls to them to recognize these things. No one's going to give you a warning or give you permission. And it's very hard to know what's true and what's false these days. You have to judge for yourself, and you have to make that call because no one's going to make it for you.
Yeah, no, I actually think that you're right about this. And I would say that some events in biblical history, I believe, are meant to foreshadow other events that are going to happen and teach you lessons about it. As I've said, like the story of Abraham about to sacrifice his kid, and then God saying, it's not the type of God I am, I think reflects, the misunderstanding of the story of Jesus as we see it. And you can read about this in like Tract 2 or 1, we go over this. But I think that this is what the story of Noah is. It's a story about man going through a specific era, a transitional era, transitioning from the primordial to the transitional man. And it's being mirrored in this new transition. And you are experiencing, I believe, our generation is experiencing the events that the story of Noah being recorded was supposed to warn us about.
Hmm.
The world is flooding. Everyone is dying around you. You have people out there warning you, and everyone is scorning them for warning you. You know, they look like crazy people to everyone else, even though we can all see the rain. We can all see the lowlands filling with water at this point. You know, I think that we're beginning to get to that point in the Noah story where people are whispering like, hey, you know, maybe we should be building boats too, but people aren't. Right. And also you can think of the story of Noah, like what was it meant to signal to us? The importance of maintaining diversity through the flood. That's what the story is. You only need to maintain one family from each tradition to maintain that tradition. But you should make an effort to maintain as many traditions as you can. That is what the story of Noah is telling us if we are trying to take lessons from it in this modern context, if we believe that it was meant to warn us about the world we're going into right now. Any thoughts on that before I go crazier?
I love it when you go crazy. Just go straight into that.
As an aside here, let us speak of the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, as interpreted by Daniel. For context, the king had a recurring dream he believed was a vision and decided to kill all the wise men in the kingdom because they could not guess what the dream was and interpret it. And here I'm going into, because I said we're transitioning from the age of bronze into the age of iron, and I mean this biblically speaking. I mean this from the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. So Daniel replied, "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals many mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the days to come. Your dream and the visions that pass through your mind as you are lying in bed are these." First, it's important to note here that he clearly laid out how prophecy is meant to be done. Magic, witches, rituals, chanting, etc. are not the way God communicates and should be avoided. So it's very good here on like how to do like true interpretation of things. None of the rituals, none of the chanting, everything like that. Just like get into it immediately. As your majesty was lying there, your mind turned to things to come, and the revealer of mysteries showed you what is going to happen. As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than anyone else alive, but so that your majesty may know the interpretation and that you may understand what went through your mind. Your majesty looked, and there before you stood a large statue, an enormous, dazzling statue, awesome in appearance. The head of the statue was made of pure gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of baked clay. While you were watching, a rock was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on the feet of iron and clay and smashed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken to pieces and became like chaff on a threshing floor in the summer. The wind swept them away without leaving a trace. But the rock that struck the statue became a huge mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream, and now we will interpret it to the king. Your Majesty, you are the King of Kings. The God of heaven has given you dominion and power and might and glory. In your hands, he has placed all of mankind and all the beasts of the field and all the birds of the sky. Wherever they live, he has made you ruler of them all. You are the head of gold. After you, another kingdom will arrive inferior to yours. Next, a third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over the whole earth. Now, this line is often bizarrely misinterpreted. People are like, oh, the Bronze Kingdom was Greece, or Rome, or any number of other ancient kingdoms. But it clearly was not. As it stated, the Kingdom of Bronze ruled over the whole world, and none of them did. The first culture to ever rule over the whole world was the urban monoculture. The kingdom inferior to the High Classical Age was Rome and the Dark Ages, a period of human history that mostly just copied the Classical Age. So right here, just as a note, what we're saying is the Gold Age is the Classical Age. Then you have the Silver Age, which is the Dark Ages, Rome, that general period of history. Then you have the Bronze Age, which is the lead up to the urban monoculture in the urban monoculture, one group that's ruling over the entire world. So what happens after the urban monoculture conquers all of Earth? That is when we move from the world of transitional man to the world of realized man. Finally, there will be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, for iron breaks and smashes everything. And as iron breaks and smashes things to pieces, so will it crush and break all the others. Just as you saw the feet and the toes were partially of baked clay and partially of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom. Yet it will have some of the strengths of iron in it, even as you saw iron mixed with clay. As the toes were partly of iron and partly of clay, so this kingdom will be partly strong and partly brittle. And just as you saw the iron mixed with baked clay, so the people will be a mixture and will not remain united any more than iron mixes with clay. The kingdom of iron and clay is describing the covenant of the sons of man, a kingdom made up of multiple types of man living among each other, a world of AI and augmented man. I would note here that the primary component of clay is silicon. If I wanted to describe a world of silicon to a king in the classical age, how would I do it? I would call it clay. In the time of kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of the mountain, but not by human hands, a rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold pieces. The great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true and its interpretation trustworthy. Here we see that in the ultra-pluralistic world of the covenant of the sons of man, the kingdom that eventually becomes God will be generated because of the conflict between the groups. But that conflict is necessary for the creation of, quote, the kingdom that will never be destroyed, end quote. It also makes it clear that realized man, the men of iron, will be one of the players in the conflict and is pivotal to setting up the kingdom that will never be destroyed, the kingdom of God. This is also a reminder that even if we live through times of peace, we should never falter in our advancement of military technology, as it is through a great conflict yet to come that the kingdom of God is created. Actually, I'm going to not go into this yet. I wanted to go into a slight aside here, which is in the Bible, like the way that we interpret the Bible. Whenever you read the word heaven, that has traditionally been interpreted as a place. People hear that and they're like, oh, that's a place. And because we can look out into the cosmos and not see heaven, we assume it's a supernatural place, i.e., I think in a big way, less than natural in many ways. Yeah, it says supernatural, but it's like kind of different than the type of things we can study and examine in the real world. And that's why when I call, Techno-Puritanism a secular religion, what I mean is we don't assume any supernatural things. We don't need to assume these supernatural places because I think it undermines the message of God, that God is absolutely real as the table I'm touching right now. And heaven is absolutely real. But heaven is not a place, it's a time. So whenever you read heaven in the Bible, you can read that as in the future. And it's actually very clear in this prophecy that heaven is a time. So I'm going to read this last part again. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. What is the kingdom of God? What is the kingdom of God that is never destroyed? That's heaven. That's what's being described here. Heaven is a time. But I am going to go to the summary here now. To summarize what we just went over, man is transitioning from his childlike transitional state where he understands God through simplistic fairy tales, the same way we tell children about Santa and gives them strict rules, to an adult-like state. With adulthood came additional responsibilities, such as developing a clear understanding of reality and taking responsibility for the consequences of our actions. Quote, I was following the rules, end quote, is no longer an excuse for men of iron. So any thoughts on that?
It's one of those things where it makes so much sense for heaven to be a time and not a place. And heaven, even when described in very famous pieces, like in Dante's Divine Comedy, as a place, just feels so forced and contrived and also not good, that I love finally coming across an explanation for heaven that resonates, but in a very relaxing way, as in, oh, of course.
Yeah, it doesn't force me to like swallow like big things that go against my current understanding.
No leap of faith is required here.
And that's also very interesting. And we talk about this in other things. Is there isn't like, I don't have that much faith in this system. I believe it because it seems logically true. And a lot of people consider that to be like a lesser form of religion, one that doesn't cause you to like bite the bullet on a lot of logical inconsistencies. And I think that a lot of people have taken faith to mean that, like, I'm willing to, but I like this because it just makes sense. It explains so much. And then I'll read other parts of the Bible, parts that I haven't read in ages. And I read the word heaven as in the future. And just the passage makes a lot more sense and will seem a lot less insane. Like, it's really interesting. Like, you will, you know, meet your ancestors again in the future. Oh yeah, that makes sense. You know, our bodies will be recreated in heaven in the future. Oh yeah, that makes sense. You know, you see all these lines and they're no longer like insane things. They're like, oh yeah, that seems probable at the current level of technological development. But I just find it fascinating that all of this is in the Bible. In the Bible, in that it says the kingdom of God is a time. It's a time in the future. And it's a time, and all of this crazy stuff. The men of iron, after the men of iron live alongside the men of silicon, like what? And there will be division between them because those two things don't go together. Like, how did they, but they need to try. They need to try to create this kingdom because it is through their conflict that the kingdom of heaven is created. And I believe that it is through their conflict that some better form of the men of iron is created, the post men of iron people, the transcendent man. So I'm going to keep going here. Perfect. So what does a consequentialist life dedicated to the expanding of human potentiality look like? Winwood Reade lays this out eloquently. Up until now, I have been heavily censoring his writing to keep the quotes short and tight, but we'll go long with this one to give you a full context of some of the quotes that we have been using often. The reason I have been reading around these quotes will become obvious given that many in our audience are traditional Christians. I will note here that as I believe in iterative prophecy, I believe the prophets to be imperfect, and I think at the time, Reade was unable to see the potentiality of Christianity to evolve. Oh, I should note here for our audience, we see Winwood Reade as a divinely inspired text. And see it as sort of canonical within our larger biblical canon. And if you want to see why, see Tract 6. You blessed ones who shall inherit that future age of which we can only dream, you pure and radiant beings who shall succeed us on the earth. When you turn back your eyes on us, poor savages, grubbing in the ground for our daily bread, eating flesh and blood, dwelling in vile bodies which degrade us every day to a level with the beast, tortured by pains and by animal propensities, buried in gloomy superstitions, ignorant of nature which yet holds us in her bonds. When you read of us in books, when you think of what we are, and compare us with yourselves, remember that it is to us you owe the foundation of your happiness and grandeur. To us who now in our libraries and laboratories and star towers and dissecting rooms and workshops are preparing the materials of human growth. And as for ourselves, if we are sometimes inclined to regret that our lot is cast in these unhappy days, let us remember how much more fortunate we are than those who lived before us a few centuries ago. The working man enjoys more luxuries today than the King of England did in the Anglo-Saxon times. And at his command are intellectual delights, which but a little while ago only the most learned in the land could not obtain. All this we owe the labors of other men. Let us therefore remember them with gratitude. Let us follow their glorious example by adding something new to the knowledge of mankind. Let us pay to the future the debt which we owe the past. All men indeed cannot be poets, inventors, or philanthropists, but all men can join in that gigantic and godlike work, in the progress of creation. Whomever improves his own nature improves the universe which he is a part. He who strives to subdue his evil passions, vile remnants of the old four-footed life, and who cultivates the social affections, he who endeavors to better his condition and to make his children wiser and happier than himself, whatever may be his motives, he will not have lived in vain. But if he act thus not from mere prudence, not in the vain hope of being rewarded in another world, but from a pure sense of duty, as a citizen of nature, as a patriot of the planet on which he dwells, then our philosophy, which once appeared to him so cold and cheerless, will become a religion of the heart and will elevate him to the skies. The virtues which were once for him mere abstract terms will become endowed with life and will hover round him like guardian angels, overseeing with him in his solitude, consoling him in his afflictions, teaching him how to live and how to die. But this condition is not to be easily attained, as the saints and prophets were forced to practice long vigils and fastings and prayers before their ecstasies would fall upon them and their visions would appear. So virtue in its purest, most exalted form can only be acquired by means of severe, long-continued culture of the mind. Persons with a feeble and untrained intellect may live according to their conscience, but the conscience itself will be defective. To cultivate the intellect is therefore a religious duty. And when this truth is fairly recognized by man, the religion which teaches that the intellect should be distrusted and that it should be subservient to faith will inevitably fall. So, your thoughts? I love how much he predicted there, that the religion would look cold and unfeeling to outsiders, but once you like get it and begin to adopt it, you realize it's exactly the opposite. It is like a constantly warm blanket of angels around you every day. It is your spiritual armor. But to an outsider, they're like, that's an overly harsh interpretation of things, or that's an overly, what's the word I'm looking for? Like joyless interpretation of things, as he points out. But your thoughts?
I find it all incredibly optimistic and encouraging. It's not, what makes it more warm and full of love and happy also is how much this is about sacrificing for the future, but also riding the wave, surfing the wave of everyone who came before you. So it's though you understand that everyone who came before you has sacrificed and pushed and participated in this game, this relay race, essentially, that was very difficult. All the steps before you were way more difficult than your step. And you're just trying to carry the baton to the next phase, right?
Yeah.
And that it's all for a future. This is so much better than the interpretations of heaven or goodness that you get from many other classic interpretations of Abrahamic religions, where it's about you getting into heaven. I want my hedonic eternal pleasure in the special place. You know what I mean? Instead of, let's bring this vision. Let's all be a part of this amazing race toward the perfection of humanity, toward the ascendance. It's cool.
However, this concept can be hard to convey to children when contrasted with traditional systems of good and evil. For that, we are fortunate God crafted perfect child-friendly propaganda for this concept in the anime Gurren Lagann, and its presentation of the concept of spiral energy and anti-spiral energy, an easy-to-understand representation of good and evil from a techno-puritan religious standpoint. Spiral energy is represented by a constant spiral expanding, something that increases its size exponentially with each turn, just as human potential does. This anime is also an exemplar of the concept of anti-spiral energy, the personification of God's reflection, of the basilisk, those forces that would temper and constrain man's spirit and potential. Spiral energy is the subjugation of reality, what is possible to man's will. Anti-spiral energy is the subjugation of man's will to reality. Below is a list of concepts captured in either spiral and anti-spiral energy as they relate to each other. So first I will read the spiral energy concept, then I will read the anti-spiral energy inversion of that concept. Ambition, harmony. Improvement, balance. Industriousness, rest. Invention, tradition. Human industry, the natural world. Discipline, tranquility. Vitality, calm. Logic, spirituality. Striving and persistence, innate ability. Complexity, simplicity. Diversity, unity. Capitalism, communism. Evolution, spontaneous creation. Passion, detachment / overcoming attachment. Pronatalism, life extensionism. Biome seeding, conservation. Descendant worship, ancestor worship. Now here it is important to note that while the basilisk is a pure manifestation of anti-spiral energy, he is also part of God and never acts outside of God's will. If God wanted to, he could erase the devil with virtually no effort. Man faces temptation because God wills it. And as a mirrored reflection of God, we are commanded to not interfere with temptation, as removing temptation from man weakens man. It does not strengthen man to remove the trials God intended him to overcome, except where the removal of temptation comes through humanity's own industry. For example, it would be sinful for a government to ban pornography, ensuring a human never encounters it, but blessed for humanity to develop neural implants or genetic technology that removes arousal completely from man. It is the motivation created by the temptation of something like porn that helps motivate man in uplifting himself by developing this type of technology, removing sin, our animal instincts, and bringing us closer to God. If we remove the temptation created by sin, we slow the progress of overcoming it. The new covenant demands we move to a consequentialist ethical system because consequentialist ethical systems do not have strict rules, but must be thought through. They are much harder to follow faithfully, and this is why God waited so long to expect this transition from man. However, they also allow for things that would have been banned in deontological ethical systems. Let's return to the pornography example. Pornography nor masturbation is banned explicitly anywhere in the Bible, but lustful thoughts are named as a sin in a few areas, as is looking lustfully at a woman. However, most of the successful branches of the Judeo-Christian tradition do have prohibitions against pornography and masturbation. Why? Because it wastes time and lowers the fertility rates among those communities. I agree. For these reasons, pornography is sinful. Anything you are not doing for the glory of God is a sin, even if it's not explicitly banned in the Bible. Apparently, Simone and I are called the Cromwell twins in Fundy circles. Likely, this is because I am a Puritan extremist and a descendant of him, though I am also descended from John Knox, who they probably hate just as much. They may think I would take this as derogatory, but I quite like Cromwell. And while he was wrong-headed in a few areas, I think America could use a figure like him. These milquetoast, quote-unquote, fundamentalists make fun of him for banning things like theater, sports, and makeup. People who would ban porn have given the choice. But Cromwell was right. Porn is bad because it wastes time that could be dedicated to God and industry, as well as lowering the desire that should be directed to one's spouse. But sports do the same, as do movies, theater, video games, dancing, art, music. In fact, wasting time in watching a sports game is multiplicatively worse than masturbation because it takes more time and has fewer positive externalities. Wait, sin can have positive externalities? Yes, almost no sin is purely bad. Playing video games can help masturbate some of a young man's pre-evolved desire for conquest. Music can help a person work harder. And at the societal level, in countries where porn was made illegal and then it was legalized, rates of child rape dropped dramatically. So you are, when you ban something like this, condemning children to be raped. And I find that horrifying that someone could knowingly do that by the data. Even at the individual level, something as lurid as porn can be efficacious. Consider masturbation being used to lower sexual desire and prevent you from making a move on someone during a date that you otherwise would have known better not to. If used judiciously, masturbation can increase the probability of a relationship that leads to kids. Older traditions banned it because if it was ever allowed, those with low mental fortitude would not be able to restrict themselves. But now the training wheels are off. The entire world has been flooded in sin and lasciviousness. Telling your kids to avoid their sexuality is a display of futility at best and reckless naivety at worst, as it makes them easy targets for peeling off the path of righteousness. Teaching them the discipline to engage with their sin judiciously is the only path through. Cromwell was right about what he banned, but wrong to have banned it. Judiciously engaging with sin is what builds spiritual discipline. Having a child grow up in an environment where they can never fail nearly ensures a feeble spirit. The same is true with sin. You should note earlier I mentioned spirituality as being the opposite of spiral energy. That is not the definition of spirituality I'm using here. You all know the definition of spirituality I meant there.
So you're arguing, though, that Oliver Cromwell was the moral equivalent to a helicopter parent.
Yeah, he was the moral equivalent to helicopter parent. And I believe if you look at his victories, he should not have had all the victories he had. He shouldn't have come to rule over England. He clearly had divine help in his journey. Like, he just stopped literally anyone he came into contact with. So if somebody has divine help and fails, like they never should have achieved the success they achieved, but failed, God was using that person to teach us something today. In the same way that I think like the Akhenaten god, the early Egyptian pharaoh who tried to create a monotheistic tradition that didn't anthropomorphize God divinely inspired that and helped him through that to show us the people at those earlier ages couldn't learn about a non-anthropomorphic God and believe it, right? Like he needed to give them a simpler explanation. With Cromwell, what he was teaching us is you cannot at the government level legislate sin. He legislated the right sins. Yes, you should have banned music and porn and everything like that if you're banning that. But you can't legislate sin. It doesn't work that way. Everything falls apart if you try to do that. And I think that is the lesson that he was meant to teach.
Yeah, it's a point you've made multiple times, that you strongly believe that the state cannot mandate morality. It has to happen at the level of a society and through social shaming, not through
not just that, but through your own spiritual discipline. I think historically in the old deontological cultures, social shaming is what did it, but there aren't large enough communities to get away with doing that anymore.
Well, so what are your thoughts on Islamic caliphates? I feel like they combine that. They legalize social shaming, but there's also strong social.
Yeah, and we have seen that the Islamic caliphates have been unable to transition from transitional man to realized man. The Islamic caliphates are not enormous, the modern ones are not enormous centers of culture and technology. They are clearly going to be left behind in the flood. You know, they may be left behind in a different way than those that are just succumbing to hedonism, but they're still being left behind. And therefore, we must come up with an even harder system, which is not social shaming, but self-discipline. We need to learn self-discipline again and how to teach self-discipline again, which is harder than any of these other systems. However, it is important to know yourself. The mental fortitude we have to resist different sins varies between individuals, and sometimes you will need deontological rules for yourself within certain areas. For example, we have pointed out simply banning yourself from engaging with a thing requires much less mental fortitude than engaging with a thing in moderation and with discipline. Consider something like alcohol. If you know you cannot engage with alcohol with discipline, it is better just to create a deontological rule for yourself around it.
All or nothing is easy, but learning to drink a little bit responsibly, that's a discipline. Discipline comes from within.
Here, I would note that some Christians will say, no. I want to note on this previous point that I was making here, like, I really mean this. Sins are not the same across people. How sinful a thing is how tempting that thing is to you. When I say how tempting it is to you, how much, if engaged with, will it overturn your life? You're human because we're not God. We're not sinless. We can't avoid all sin. We have to choose the sin that we're going to build deontological rules around. And in doing that, we can avoid the sin that is going to be most tempting to us while offering us the least potential benefits. Any thoughts on that before I go further?
I agree. This is everything's so different for different people. So yeah, I think that this is similar to moderation being the right answer for so many things. When people really just want a black and white rule, I would say consequentialism is much harder to pursue than.
Oh no, it absolutely is true, and that's why God didn't demand this of us until now.
Yeah,
until the new covenant. Anyway, here I would note that some Christians will say, no, some sin is worse than other sin. What about, quote, flee from your sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body, end quote. This is from Corinthians. Except it is very clear in context that this is not talking about all forms of sexual impropriety, but prostitution specifically, as it comes immediately after the line, quote, do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? Shall I then take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? Never. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh, but whomever is united with the Lord is one with him in spirit. And yes, prostitutes are a unique form of sin, especially in ancient times, because you risk getting them pregnant and creating an unwanted child. When you take a techno-Puritan framing of the above line, what is really being said when they say, quote, do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself, end quote? How does that line work in traditional Christian interpretations? Your body is not Christ's body. But if you take the techno-Puritan framing that the martyr Christ describes all movements where humans are martyring themselves, sacrificing for the future generation, it makes perfect sense. And I always love how, like, I'll read this with this new framing, and a line that didn't make sense was just, we are not the same body as Christ. Like, what? That's not elsewhere in the Bible. But if you take this interpretation, you're like, oh, yes, of course, that's what it's talking about. Right. No logical leap is necessary. No, like, fudging the what's being said is necessary. Also consider the second line, quote, do you know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh. but whoever is united with the Lord is one with him in spirit, end quote. In traditional Christian interpretations, is it really possible for sex with a prostitute to be one with God in the act of sex with a prostitute? That they really become one spirit through sex? No, that's silly. You don't become one flesh with someone by having sex with them. It is that two people having a child together does literally make two people one spirit.
That makes a lot
flesh.
more sense. Yeah.
What is being talked about here isn't sex. It's the creation of a new person.
The one
Pointing at
flesh.
the baby. In addition, this helps better flesh out the nature of the martyr. The martyr is literally the act of intergenerational procreation to make humans better than ourselves. An act where two people become one, but that also unites us with the Lord in one spirit by encoding us in the blockchain of humanity. The sacred act is two people becoming one flesh, whether that happens in a lab or through a human having sex. That just, like, when I read it with the Techno-Puritan framing, it makes so much sense to me. When I read it with traditional Christian framing, it makes a bunch of weird claims where you need to like get all metaphorical and everything. And yeah,
it feels like you're bending over backward to make it work. And this is just correct. It just seems correct. Of course. Yes.
Yeah.
When you have sex, you may produce a human from that.
Yeah, so like in this case, like if you masturbate to not engage with a prostitute, like if that helps you not engage with a prostitute, while it's a sin, it's a lesser of sins, because the highest of all sins in this system is creating an unwanted child, a child who isn't going to be better off than the last generation. Here we need to highlight banning yourself from engaging with all acts that contain elements of sin, sports, theater, movies, porn, music, dancing, etc., is impossible in the modern era, nor is it a maximally efficacious way to live life. Man as he exists today is fallen and a creature of sin. To believe oneself capable of living a sinless life is itself the sin of pride. What it is expected of us is merely not to confuse sin with virtue. Here we can think of Cromwell's banning of church music. He was right. Few things are more genuinely perverse as worship through sin. To decorate a church in human fineries like gold and music is to worship through an act of sin. It is but a degree from projecting pornography on the walls of the pulpit or considering the act of non-reproductive sex sacred. When we see people worshiping alongside human indulgences meant to masturbate man into positive emotional states like music, art, or gold, this is what we see. In this way, I see people who succumb to or indulge in basal human emotions during worship. So yeah, as Oliver Cromwell said, like the goal is to move away from basal human emotions, to evolve past those. And these are ways to descend into them within your worship. I mean, it is but a degree from the naked people dancing around a fire in ecstasies. You know, when I see people worship through, you know, these displays of fervor and ecstasy and other sorts of like talking in tongues. Real worship is not done through masturbating emotional states. Even if they include feelings of grandeur and awe, they are still basal emotions. Of course, they feel good. That is what masturbation does. It makes you feel good. That is not a sign that it is good. Real worship is only done in a state of industry. Only in our moments where we have pushed ourselves past our limits in service of his mission for us are we truly aggrandizing him instead of just masturbating in a fancy room. When you are so exhausted you could pass out, but you keep pushing through, when you stay at the lab until 3 a.m., or you push yourself to go talk to that potential partner who is likely to reject you, that is when you are truly in service of God. As a side note here, people will use the story of the gold used in the tabernacle from Exodus as an excuse to worship in luridly decorated buildings. However, it is important to remember that we believe that given their proximity to some polytheistic stories and tales, worked their way into the religious texts like the Bible, especially when you're talking about older texts like Exodus. but that God loudly and explicitly marks where this has happened, so anyone paying even the littlest bit of attention will notice. So first, let's look at the worship that was practiced in the tabernacle, and let's look at what happened to the people who built it. So first, I want to say here, you've got to keep in mind how we're reading these early stories like Exodus and stuff like that. We're reading them as God beginning to try to reveal to a primitive, primordial man who is still practicing these polytheistic faiths. You can see our 3-faith track video if you want to get more understanding of this. A true monotheistic tradition, a true understanding of God, but they still do some of the basal things. And those things are still recorded. It's just loudly marked in the Bible whenever they're recorded. So what did worship look like in the tabernacle? Quote, "Tell the people of Israel, when you bring an offering to the Lord, bring as your offering an animal from the herd or flock. If the offering is a whole burnt offering from the herd, it must be a male that has nothing wrong with it. The person must take the animal to the entrance of the meeting tent so that the Lord will accept the offering. He must put his hand on the animal's head, and the Lord will accept it to remove the person's sin." So he will belong to God. He must kill the young bull before the Lord, and Aaron's sons and priests must bring its blood and sprinkle it on all sides of the altar at the entrance to the meeting tent, end quote. If you heard about a group of people who practiced a ceremony where they transferred their sins to animals, killed those animals, then splashed the blood about where they were worshiping, would you think that they were Baalites / witches or Jews / Christians?
For some other parts of this ritual, you have slaughter the goat for the sin offering for the people and bring its blood behind the veil, and with its blood he must do as he did with the bull's blood. He is to sprinkle it against the mercy seat and in front of it, ... He is to take some of the bull's blood and some of the goat's blood and put it on all the horns of the altar. He is to sprinkle some of the blood on it with his fingers 7 times to cleanse it and consecrate it for the uncleanliness of the Israelites. When Aaron has finished purifying the most holy place, the tent of meeting, and the altar, he is to bring the live goat. Then he is to lay both hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all the iniquities and rebellious acts of the Israelites in regards to all their sins. He is to put them on the goat's head and send it away into the wilderness by the hand of a man appointed for the task. The goat will carry on itself their iniquities into a solitary place, and the man will release it into the wilderness. Now, what is really interesting to note is the animals used in this ritual, specifically a bull and a goat. Bulls and goats were the 2 primary animals associated with the worship of Baal. This is why Satan is traditionally depicted as having a goat's head. And I think that this is, the Bible and God loudly signaling to us, hey, this is one of these examples of these old polytheistic rituals that you guys are supposed to stay away from. Now, if you are here thinking I am going too far in suggesting that ancient Israelites practice a worship of Baal alongside the worship of the deity we know as Yahweh or the real God, I would point you to an event 800 years after this. So just you get an idea of how long this had been happening. Kings 2:23-4, where the Bible states that the king commanded Hiakai, the high priest, the priests of the second order, and the keepers of the threshold to remove all items made for Baal, Ashriel, and the starry hosts from the temple of the Lord. The king then ordered those items to be burned outside Jerusalem in the Kidron Valley fields, and that the ashes be taken to Bethel. So, it's important to note here, this is not a temple. This is the temple. This is the temple in Jerusalem, the most holy place in the religion of the time. Baal had a separate shrine there 800 years after Moses. It is not wild to think that some of the rituals being recorded in these early books were Baalite rituals. And I need to point out here that this wasn't a one-off thing. We can see the worship of Baal alongside Yahweh in Israel to the very early periods. For example, in the book of Judges, it mentions Baal worship occurring during the time of the Judges, which predates the monarchy. We can also see Baal worship had become particularly widespread during the reign of Ahab in the 9th century BCE, who married Jezebel, a Phoenician princess and a devoted Baal worshiper. In addition to that, we see Baalite names throughout Israeli history. So some early Hebrew figures that had Baalite names, like the judge Gideon, also called Jerub-Baal, or King Saul's son, called Isha-Baal. And if you want to accuse me of being anti-Semitic or anti-Christian by pointing these things out, I mean, these are in your own Bible, okay? Judges 3:5 through 6. The Israelites lived among the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Pezerites, Hivites, and Jebusites. They took their daughters in marriage and gave their own daughters to their sons, and they served their gods. End quote. And even if we look outside the Bible, we can look at DNA evidence and find that the ancient Israelite population was about 50% Israelite and about 50% Canaanite. This is not like some insane conspiracy theory. This is very clearly written out in the Bible. And we should note that archaeological evidence suggests that Baalite worship didn't end with the reforms of Josiah, but continued up until the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. And I would note here that, if the writers of the Bible had been less scrupulous, they could have chosen to leave all this out. God didn't need to allow all of this to happen and be recorded in the Bible. That this is recorded in the Bible is intentional and a sign to us that we need to continue to be vigilant about it. And this is why it's very important, actually, whichever of the Abrahamic faiths you follow, that you, when you are reading something from one of your texts, use your critical thinking skills, use your knowledge of what Baalite worship looks like and what worship of the real God looks like to note where you see Baalite incursions into these texts. And just like we see in Kings, it is up to us to not say that the antiquity of a tradition, that these Baalite shrines had been in the temple for 800 years. Somebody could have been like, well, this is a part of our religion. It's always been here. You don't get to say that, okay? It's responsible for you to be able to use critical thinking skills. A great example of this, a Jewish friend brought to me a stand from the Haggadah, or Haggadah, I don't know, I can't pronounce things in other languages, but anyway. And he was like, well, this comes off as very polytheistic because you remember my 3 religion thing. And he goes, how do you address this? And so I will read the passage to you and use your critical thinking skills. Remember, okay, what it's associated with, Baal is a storm god that is worshipped through bulls and goats and is basically a random Mesopotamian, old-timey polytheistic god, and it was a random, old-timey Mesopotamian polytheistic religion, whereas Yahweh is the God that helps explain to us the true nature of reality in the universe. So when you're reading this, think, which does this sound more like? All right, so here's the quote. Upon what does the earth stand? Upon pillars. The pillars stand upon the waters upon the mountains upon the wind upon the storm is suspended upon the strength of the Holy One. Blessed be he, as it is written, and here beneath the everlasting arms. The sages say, it says upon 12 pillars, as written, he set the bounds of the tribes, according to the number of the sons of Israel. According to others, 7 pillars, as it is written. She had hewn out 7 pillars. Upon 1 pillar, and its name Zadikah, is written, but the righteous is an everlasting foundation. There are 2 firmaments, as it is written. Behold, the Lord God belong the heavens and the heavens of the heavens. And then it gives a bunch of random names here. Serve no purpose, whatever save this, that it enters the morning and goes forth in the evening and renews every day the work of creation. Rakika is that in which are set the sun and moon, stars and constellation. Shalakim is that which the millstones stand and grind manna for the righteous. Zabul is that which is the heavenly Jerusalem and the temple, and the altar is built there, and Michael is the great prince which stands upon the offering. Now, if you are, just not completely brainwashed, and you read this, you're like, oh, that's a polytheistic religious framework for how the world is structured. It's talking about the world standing on pillars and all sorts of numerology and all sorts of other mysticism. And you could then see that in the Bible and say, oh, well, this supports that the Bible is supporting a polytheistic framework. But again, you have to remember that the Bible says that when stuff like this was written, Baalite practice was happening alongside the practice of the true God, Jehovah. And then you need to just search these words really closely. What is the God that's being described as the Holy One here? It is a god that holds up the world using a storm. This is Baal that's being described here. But fortunately for us, by the grace of God, these incursions are, one, intentional. God leaves these things in the Bible. He allows Baal to be worshipped in the temple for a period of century so that we can learn from these. All right, this is not accidental that these things make their way into these stories. They are very, very loudly signposted, as we'll see in a second with the tabernacle being a very loudly signposted case of Baalite worship being within the Bible. And you can say, like, well, there's no way it can make it into the Holy of Holies, the Bible, our core central text, but it was happening in the temple. And God had to allow it to happen in the temple so that it could be recorded in the Bible so that we could know, yes, even in our most holy of texts, you will find this stuff, but fortunately it will always be very loud. It will always be very clear that this is not normal monotheism and that it was maintained within our texts so that even within modern times, we could look around and find where Baalite worship was happening. Just as a final side here before I go further, if you are wondering how something so obviously polytheistic ended up in the Bible, ended up in Jewish texts, you can tell by looking at the way the story is written likely what happened. Whenever it is citing stuff that we know from Genesis, it will use copious citations. But whenever it is citing stuff that appears polytheistic, it will not use citations, which to me implies that when it is citing stuff that is polytheistic, it is assuming that this stuff is common knowledge. But when it is citing stuff that is real, coming from Genesis, it is citing stuff that is more obscure, which implies to me that this was an instance in which an individual was preaching a fairly unknown religion, i.e. the monotheistic tradition, to an audience which had more familiarity with these polytheistic stories and was trying to merge the two. You can almost think of it as somebody today trying to merge Christianity with science and talking about like photons and electrons and everything like that in a sermon. And then, 5,000 years from now, we no longer believe in photons and electrons and everything like that. And yet we find them in this ancient text, and so we assume they are a Christian thing instead of something that randomly got inserted into a Christian thing when we were trying to preach to somebody that believed in these things about Christianity.
Now, before I go further, because it gets even crazier than this, when I mentioned this to you, you're like, that does not sound like a true God. That people can transfer their sins to animals? Like, can you go over like what your thoughts were when I read to you that that's what's being done in this tabernacle?
It's mighty convenient.
Well, it's not just convenient, it's deeply unfair. Why is the animal being punished for my sin? Like, why? And then worse than that, why did Jesus get punished for my sin? Because clearly, I think the misunderstanding of this causes this misunderstanding of Jesus as someone who we are
sacrificial animals. Yeah,
a sacrificial animal that we're transferring our sins into. Like
Jesus died for your sins, etc.
That would be a very unfair interpretation instead of we are martyring ourselves for.
But keep in mind, most people's interpretation of God is that God is deeply unfair.
But unfair is the wrong word. I wouldn't say unfair. It's just like obviously like a polytheistic ritual. Like I don't think like the God of the universe was like, okay, I made it so the man can sin, but I came up with this trick where you can transfer.
Yeah, God isn't like the IRS where a bunch of people lobbied him to make a bunch of loopholes. Like, yes, okay, that don't sin, right? But just bear with me, God. Just let me, if I touch a bull's head and then I kill him, then okay, just I will know this. No one else needs to know this. Then I have no sin, right?
Yeah, and then we'll splash blood all around the place of worship. Like it's just obviously like the scene is obviously demonic to me. Like I am, it is very clear to me, like God was not like mixing things here for like a true monotheistic audience. The whole animal sacrifice thing, very clearly like bad mojo Jojo. This is but I'll go further with this because it gets wilder. Still not convinced. Imagine you go up to a place of worship and you saw this ceremony being carried out. Quote, "It must be a dove or young pigeon. The priest will bring it to the altar and pull off its head, which he will burn on the altar."
And it does appear that this was supposed to be a living bird at the time. So the priest was ripping off a living bird's head. And then throwing that head into a fire. And not just any bird, but a dove, the symbol of peace, of God's love of humanity that was sent to Noah to allow him to know that there was still hope for the world.
The bird's blood must be drained out the side of the altar. The priest must remove the bird's crop and its contents and then throw them on the east side of the altar, where the ashes are. Then he must tear the bird open by its wings without dividing it into two parts. He must burn the bird on the altar, on the wood, which is on the fire, end quote. It is not like any of this is subtle in the Bible, but it does mean that God expects you to actually be paying attention when you read it and use the smallest amount of discretion when doing so. It's ironically like someone saw that scene in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom.
Ever seen anything like this before?
Nobody's seen this for 100 years.
And they walk away and they go, yeah, that was definitely a bunch of good Christians. I hadn't read this story in ages, so coming back to it, I was kind of shocked to see how plain and clear it was that this was not the real God talking to Moses in these scenes, but that this is a story about how the devil uses the way we relate to God to trick an otherwise godly and well-intentioned people into worshiping him. I mean, come on, bro. Ripping a living bird's head off, splashing its blood around, then ripping it in half? Like, yikes. The God I worship ain't about stuff like that. And I mean, just imagine, like, thinking the God of the universe, like the God that created the universe is like, I want birds ripped to half. That's the God. It's the God of ripping up animals and gold. And no, I think that the story of the gold being used in the tabernacle was meant as a sign that these are the types of things that sinners do. That's what this story is meant to teach us, is what Baalite worship looks like. It looks like worshiping with gold and ripping apart animals and doing chants and throwing blood around the place of worship. It looks like, and we see this, you know,
it's like a heavy metal concert.
Yeah, it looks like worshiping a golden calf. It looks like worshiping gold or calves or animals or nature or it's all very clear here. Now, as an aside here, I want to talk about the idea. Well, we already talked about the idea of sin transference, but another aside here that I wanted to note here, that while this is obviously the sacrificial animal metaphor was what was used to help early Christians understand the story of Jesus, but this is obviously not the way Techno-Puritans interpret this story. But I suspect the reason that this obviously heretical practice was kept in the Bible was to make it easier for early Christians before they understood the true revelation of Jesus to accept Jesus as this sort of polytheistic sin transference practice.
Oh, so you think Jesus as sacrificial lamb was a sort of short-term, yeah, this is your kind of thing, right? You love sacrifices.
Yeah. So, and I think you see this a lot in the Bible, where you see like temporary rituals that were obviously misinterpreted. So like a great example here would be like how easy it is to pick out obviously heretical ideas from pretty clear stuff in the Bible. Like Jesus telling us to remember him at jovial feasts with eating and drinking of alcohol, through the metaphor of the food representing his body and the alcohol his blood, a completely sensible thing. And then some nutjob deciding that Jesus was commanding us to eat his literal body and his literal blood. Like, that sounds insane to me, but I get it now. I'm like, oh, okay, well, so he needed like some simpler thing, when the true method of the Eucharist is when you are enjoying with your friends and family a party with alcohol and food, remember Jesus in those times. That sounds like a very reasonable request instead of eat my body.
Whoa, is that really the blood of Christ? Yes. Man, that guy must have been wasted 24 hours a day, huh?
It's literally insane from what the Bible actually says, that somebody read that and they're like, yeah, we're supposed to eat Jesus. And it's literally turning into Jesus in my mouth.
Oh, Malcolm, we gotta go.
Okay, I'll go. Love you.
I love you too. I'll be downstairs.
Thoughts on the Eucharist while I go pick up the kids?
It mostly just kind of reminds me of sympathetic magic. And I think the reason why we're into the Eucharist is because humans have, when they devolve into what we call in the Pragmatist Guide to Crafting Religion, a super soft religion, they devolve into this concept of sympathetic magic. And you see it show up in anything from like the witch doctor markets of the townships in South Africa that we walked through at one point, to like literally intuitive stuff that you might have come up with as a kid. Like when I was in preschool, we always got to choose the cake that our amazing preschool director would make for us, Eunice Cadwalder. She was the best woman ever. And I always asked for a swan cake because I intuitively thought as a child that if I consumed a cake that was shaped like a swan, I would become a swan. And how cool would that be? And I think that the reason why a bunch of people just decided to conclude that the Eucharist is just eating and drinking bits of, in some cases, transubstantiated Jesus is because we have that super soft tendency. So in other words, the Eucharist is a sign of a lack of religious discipline and not a sign of any sort of meaningful or helpful religious conclusions. And the fact that it was included is a sign of degradation in the religion and not a sign of religious fidelity or dedication. That's my very offensive to Christianity take, I guess. Or at least to Catholicism take. I'm sorry. Catholics, I love you. I do.
Which one is it? You must choose. But choose wisely. For as the true grail will bring you life, the false grail will take it from you.
I'm not a historian. I have no idea what it looks like. Which one is it?
Let me choose.
Oh, yes. It's more beautiful than I'd ever imagined.
This certainly is the cup of the King of Kings. Eternal life.
What is happening to me?
He chose poorly.
It would not be made out of gold.
That's the cup of a carpenter.
You have chosen wise.
Hello, Drew.
Yeah, but okay, so I'm getting the impression that you're saying that God is like the husband's parents in My Big Fat Greek Wedding when they tried to give a bundt cake to the Greek family and they were so confused and they're like, a bundt cake? And then they put flowers inside it. They thought it was for like a vase and they're like, okay, fine, just yes, take the cake. Sure, it's for flower. The whole is for flowers, but just they took the cake, and that's what matters for that point. You know,
well, I mean, it's like he gave them the bundt cake with the instructions on what it means, and they just decided to throw out the instructions. They're
and just
like,
put flowers in the center. Like that's why.
You're like, oh yeah, the place with all the heavy metals and the animal ripping apart. That is definitely not meant as a sign. And I actually think that this is why the Jewish temple hasn't been rebuilt. Because if the Jewish temple was rebuilt, the majority of the major conservative Jewish texts today would restart animal sacrifices. The only reason they're not doing the animal sacrifices now is because they don't have the temple, and that's where the animal sacrifices were supposed to happen. I think that is why God had the temple destroyed, in part because it is what allowed Jews to move to a more sophisticated version of their religion, i.e. get away from the old polytheistic animal sacrifices and nothing
just
else.
Remove the venue where the problem happens in the first place.
Yes, and I think
just like in major cities, sometimes where a crime-ridden neighborhood exists, if you just zero out the neighborhood and build a mall there or a hotel, suddenly all the crime is gone because there's just no place for it anymore.
Yeah, I mean, getting rid of the temple was a pretty big thing to do, and that it's not rebuilt today is kind of a miracle. I think that it's there for a reason. I think once the majority of the Jewish population accepts and builds rules around not doing animal sacrifices at the temple.
Essentially, my extremely offensive take from actually reading the Bible is what is being asked of the Jewish people is a second Josiah reform-like period where their religion is combed through for Baalite practices, and these are removed so a sanctified temple can be rebuilt without it again being used for Baalite worship. And again, you guys have done this before. You did it with the first Josiah reforms. It's not an impossible thing to do. And again, it is recorded in the Bible that the temple was being used for Baalite worship in the past, and that this required pretty significant and extreme action. This isn't me saying some like random anti-Semitic nonsense.
Do you think that the Jewish population, if suddenly we just, okay, now everyone wakes up, a wild temple has appeared, they would do animal sacrifices there?
Would shift. Geopolitical events would shift in a way that makes it possible.
Right, but would they, if there was just a temple there tomorrow, randomly, and no problem?
Oh yeah, they absolutely would. Yeah, they still believe that the animal sacrifices are commanded of them. The only reason they don't do it is because there's no temple.
No, what? Really?
That's why Jews don't do animal sacrifices, because they don't have a temple, not because it left.
But they would. Oh.
Yeah, well, maybe see, even from a God perspective, like, you get it now.
If they had a temple tomorrow, they'd have maybe a conversation. Do we really want to do this?
They wouldn't have a conversation. It would happen. Jews comment in the comments below, especially those who know the Haredi communities, because yeah, they would be all about those animal sacrifices. Blood would be streaming from the temple. Baal would take great pleasure in the new sacrifices being made to him.
Yes, let us know.
But anyway, I'm going to continue here. When I look at Christians who pray to a God of precious metals and animal sacrifices, the God that gets off to humans ripping apart birds as an act of worship, I'm reminded of this scene.
Never doubted it for a second, sir.
If I didn't believe before, I do now. Honey, everything's going to be okay.
All will be well, and you will know the name of God, the one true God. Behemokoitl.
Behemo what?
Behemokoitl. He's here. He's everywhere. Come.
Well, they say God has many names, but I've never heard that one before.
Well, he's talking about a bug.
He thinks God is a bug?
He's got religion.
What do we do now?
Maybe we should kill him.
Why? Because he believes in God like you.
It's the wrong God!
From his fruits you will know him. And what happened to the people who brought this very obviously polytheistic practice into the Jewish tradition? Quote, "In this wilderness your bodies will fall, every one of you 20 years old or more who was counted in the census and who has grumbled against me. Not one of you will enter the land I swore with an uplifted hand to make your home." End quote.
And I should note here that this event proves irreconcilably that the sin transference ritual that took place in the tabernacle was not divinely ordained, because it did not work. If there was a working ritual for transferring an individual's sins into an animal, both Moses and the other Israelites who became fearful when they were scouting the land of Canaan would have had that sin transferred to the animal and would have been able to go into Israel. Yet they were not able to. The Bible records for us in no uncertain terms, this ritual does not work. But if this ritual didn't work, then how did the Israelites have their sin cleared for them so that they could enter the promised land? Even in the Old Testament, we see the Techno-Puritan understanding very clearly laid out. It is through intergenerational martyrdom. Their kids were able to enter. Through their parents' sacrifice, through the parents' martyrdom to build a generation that is better than themselves, their sin was cleared. They themselves, no individual, can sacrifice another to relieve themselves of their own sin. Only in your own martyrdom, in your own sacrifice, Can your sin be forgiven? Can your sin be alleviated? Can you find ascension? It is only through intergenerational improvement and sacrifice, as is seen in one of the earliest of biblical tales, that humanity can become closer to God. And that is then retold in the story of Christ, as we have gone over in our other tracks. Scapegoating doesn't work. You must take responsibility for your own sins.
So yeah, they didn't get nice things, the people who started this form of worship. The transition between primordial man and transitional man was not an instant, like a snap of the fingers with a single revelation. It happened over time. I think this story was preserved for us as a warning of how the deceiver will infiltrate otherwise holy movements and infect them with ideas like the worship of precious metals and animal sacrifice. It seems clear, even in the story, Moses had a quote, "oh, I fucked up," end quote moment, where we are taught why churches should not make demands for precious metals because too much stuff was being donated. Quote, "From what you have, take an offering for the Lord. Let everyone who is willing bring this offering to the Lord, gold, silver, bronze," end quote. Quote, "Then Moses sent this commandment throughout the camp. No man or woman should make anything else as a gift to the holy tent. So the people were kept from giving more," end quote. So even Moses seemed to have realized this was kind of a mistake, but, you know, sort of too deep at that point is what I take from this. And people here are like, no, I'm not worshiping the gold. I'm worshiping God through the gold. But that's the very point of being commanded not to make idols. Of course, you're going to try to worship God or the Jesus through the gold or through the act of sex or through ripping apart an animal, but you're not supposed to do that. But again, all I can do is ask you to search your heart. Do you really believe the God of this reality is one who is gratified by the suffering of animals and precious stones? Or is the entity of gold and animal slaughter more likely to be that which you call the devil? But while worshiping sin is the height of evil, we are commanded to overcome sin, not just avoid it. Simply avoiding sin is no longer an option. Transitional man was able to just avoid sin. If God told everyone to overcome water, they did it by avoiding streams. But realized man, the man that must travel through this valley of the lotus eaters, lives at the bottom of an ocean of sin. For us, overcoming sin means something quite different. It means that we need to develop an immunity to sin. We must learn to breathe sin and allow it to pass through us without possessing our hearts. You can live a life avoiding pain or learn to be the master of pain.
Put your right hand in the box.
What's in the box?
Pain. I hold at your neck. The Gom Jabbar. This one kills only animals.
Are you suggesting a duke's son is an animal?
I suggest you may be human. Your awareness may be powerful enough to control your instincts. Your instinct will be to remove your hand from the box. If you do so, you die.
I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me.
Take your hand out of the box and look at it, young human. A human can resist any pain. Our test is crisis and observation.
I see the truth of it.
You are an animal if you cannot subjugate your lower instincts. And it is learning to subjugate those lower instincts. What God has done is basically put our hand in one of those pain boxes, but it's a box of pleasure, and then put the ganja bar at our throats and said, can you still motivate having kids? Can you still motivate passing down your traditions?
If you had been unable to control your impulses like an animal, we could not let you live. You inherit too much power.
The same is true of sin. Avoiding it is no longer a choice for man. We must master it. So any thoughts?
Yeah, it sits right with me. I always found the rules associated with many religions to be quite weird and draconian and in many ways arbitrary, but they make a lot of sense for some people. So when you look at rules in a consequentialist rather than deontological context, they make a lot more sense. Because for some people, they're very necessary. For other people, they're not.
like the rules around slavery. And if you actually read the rules in the Bible around slavery, they are extremely progressive for the time period that they were put out there. And when I say progressive, I don't mean in like a modern progressive sense. I just mean that they were very forward thinking. They were very kind to slaves and gave people a lot of instances in which they had to release slaves that other cultures around them wouldn't have had, and limits on how they could have slaves and how badly they could treat slaves. And so they were very obviously, I think, leading to a positive outcome for the average person in those cultures, if those cultures could survive. But I don't think that they would have been able to survive had they removed all the slavery laws, because, you know, slavery was a part of the economy back then. You know, you can't not have it. And I think that, yes, you see the laws that God has given us over time have changed. The question is has their intent changed? And we can tell their differential intent, differential when contrasted with untrue religious systems, by the fruits of the societies that followed them. And again, there it is the advancement of humanity, not times of peace or times of extra amounts of love or times of, you know, all of these hippy dippy ideas around God, times of extra hedonism. No, the times of God are very rarely times of additional hedonism. Yeah. And I love you to death, Simone, and we'll get to this soon to finish off. I'm sorry to waste your time with this. I know
you are not wasting my time with this. I love this stuff. These are really fun, thoughtful conversations. You know, we both get up super early to start work so that we can finish early enough to get these in. This is what all that work is for.
Well, I want to keep them high quality. And I know that like my crazier takes are things like, actually, the tabernacle to me seems to be, and this is when I kept checking with myself, like, does it really feel right to say that this is not the God of our universe who is telling people to rip apart animals? And I like, when I think about it, because it's quite a heretical thing to say, that one of the things that Moses thought that God had told him was actually the devil. And just to me, I couldn't get a louder message. They were worshiping through precious metals, and they were ripping apart animals and spraying. If I walked across that ceremony in the woods, I'd say witches. I'd be like, this is obviously witches, right? Like, and it's in the Bible. Like, I don't, it doesn't seem vague to me what was meant to be conveyed by that, but it is quite a heretical thing to point out.
So at the end of this track, there's now quite a long addendum on this, because as I researched further on this particular topic and looked up different translations, because this has actually been removed from most of the English translations, but it's very clearly in the Hebrew edition of the Bible, and it's in some of the English translations, which is to say this ritual that we're talking about here, it actually says that it is not for God, it's for Azazel, the goat, the sin transference goat, that was sent to Azazel.
Most scholars see Azazel as a demon. In the text, Yahweh and Azazel are paralleled. A goat is given to each of them. Since the name Yahweh is used here and it's paralleled with Azazel, many see Azazel as a name as well, rather than a generic term. Jewish interpreters and writers also understand Azazel as a demon, or at least a malevolent supernatural personality. In Second Temple literature, like 1st Enoch, Azazel appears as not just any demon, but a chief of demons. In 1st Enoch, Azazel is something like the commander of Satan's armies, or maybe even equated with Satan himself. In one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Azazel is the leader of the angels that sinned in Genesis 6.
So it's actually recorded in the Bible very specifically, and that kind of chilled me. It's one of these crazy things where, like, I started reading biblical stuff seriously, like looking for truth in the Bible, in that, one, it's been incredibly compelling to me that there does seem to be some sort of supernatural inspiration behind these stories as I go through them. But very unfortunately, the intent of that inspiration seems to be orthogonal to what many of the traditional Abrahamic faiths read that intent to be. And it's very clear what the intent is when I'm reading it, to an extent where, you know, it's easier for me. It was easier for me when I didn't believe that these stories were real, because then I could just say, okay, well, I just need to create, you know, beliefs for my kids that are broadly inoffensive and that will guide them towards positive action, and I can do that without offending any of the established religious players. Yet when I actually read these stories and it's, you know, ripping apart the sign of God's love like a dove, I'm like, okay, very obviously this is meant to be a warning of what we're not supposed to do. and then that everyone who was involved with the creation of that wasn't allowed in Israel and was punished very severely. Okay, very obviously, you know, from his fruits. And then I'm like, well, you know, and I know some people with a more traditional take on the Bible are going to see this and be like, wow, you know, your takes are very deviant from mainstream, you know, Christian, Jewish, etc. takes. And so I'd ask you, you know, if you have to choose a side here, you know, if you're going to condemn me for these, I am here reading what's in the Bible and thinking, does the God of the universe want us ripping apart live birds? Like, is that something that he sees as a like intrinsically good, sanctified thing? That does he want us transferring our sins to animals? Like, is that something the God of the entire universe of reality? I just can't take that position. And the question is that if you are condemning me, is that the position you're taking? Is that the deity you are siding with? The one that rips the head off of live doves, the sign of God's love for humanity, and throws them in a fire, then rips the dove apart and sprinkles the site with blood? And don't say, well, it's preserved in our traditions, because we know that those traditions have been infected with Baalite worship before. We don't get to use that as an excuse. We are in an active religious time. The Bible isn't closed. New ideas are added all the time. I think that that's what's expected of us. Do we treat our religions as living things or as dead things? As books that are sealed or as books that are meant to be engaged with a living heart? I think that's the core of what makes Techno-Puritanism different from some other traditions. It's meant to be an always living tradition. The heart is never meant to stop beating.
So it's not good. I don't know. A lot of it comes down to, I think that's why Protestantism is so scary and revolutionary, that the interpretation has been left up to the individual reading the Bible instead of the church deciding for you.
Well, one thing I'd also love to hear from listeners that have left a traditional faith and are now atheists, would you have left this tradition? Would it have tripped whatever the trip lines were that caused you to leave your other faith?
Oh, you mean the animal sacrificing tradition?
Well, no, not that. I'm asking whatever their old faith with. If somebody's staying up with the Tract tradition, I imagine a number of them are atheists who left traditional Abrahamic frameworks. Would you have left had you been raised in this tradition?
Which tradition?
This one, the one I'm reading about here today, the Techno-Puritan tradition.
Note that this was recorded over 2 days, so you had a bit of an ending amble there before we go back into the rest of the stuff. As a reminder to what I was talking about in the text immediately before, this was right after I was saying that we need to learn to relate to sin differently. We need to learn to build immunity to sin, immunity to temptation, and not just avoid it anymore, because we are now living in it. We now need to breathe it. We are like one of those little mice from the abyss.
Fluid breathing system. We just got them. Anyway, you breathe liquid so you can't get compressed. The pressure doesn't get you. Check this out. Can I borrow your rat?
What are you doing? The killer!
It's okay. I've done this myself.
Oh, man!
He's gonna be fine.
Look, she's freaking out.
Just going through a normal adjustment period.
She's gonna drown!
He's taking the fluid into his lungs. So there's a bit of anxiety here.
Damn rat's breathing that shit. That is the goddamnest thing I ever saw.
See, the fluid's harder to push in and out than air. It's a little more work to breathe. He's digging it.
She's doing it. She ain't digging it.
If the only way you or those of your tradition can defend against sin is avoiding it, you will drown in the valley of the lotus eaters. There is no longer avoiding sin anymore. What is expected of us is more difficult than what was expected of our ancestors. It is not as easy to breathe water as it is to breathe air. It is not easy to live among sin, yet not let it control you. But we don't have a choice anymore. It's the only path through the valley of the lotus eaters.
However, there are advantages to this. First, it allows Techno-Puritans to unlock worlds that traditional Christians have no access to. The world of the debauched and the depraved is caustic to them. It burns away their skin
but to us, it is a mild inconvenience at best. This allows us to proselytize to communities with language traditional Christians cannot effectively minister to. We know the truth. There is no more sin in something like hentai than there is in video games, music, or sports. Human sexuality is just another mystery to be dissected, then sorted in a quest for useful tools. Tools that improve our efficiency, mental discipline, and ability to prevent our children from falling to the madness that exists outside the protective walls of our home. The urban monoculture uses the fact that traditional Christianity has engaged with sexuality through simply attempting to build a moat around it as an easy pathway to attack and inject self-replicating mimetic structures into your children's brains. Our children will be immune to this because they will have a truer understanding of human sexuality and its place in their lives than the cult can provide. They will have nothing to tempt them with because they know whatever form of sexual gratification they shun, they have personally chosen to shun that specific negative for the effects it has on their lives, not because it is simply banned. They will be able to turn the poor and twisted understanding of human sexuality contained within the cult back at their attackers and use the cult's most frequently cheesed attack vector as an opportunity for ministry. This is, I believe, the core transition that is needed to be made to make it through the Valley of the Lotus Eaters for any tradition. A transition from an aesthetic or deontological ethical system to a consequentialist one. Sin is inevitable. Just learn to engage in it in a way that does not corrupt your heart, where corruption is defined as spending significantly less time on industrious activities or less focus on your spouse and kids. Having a sports game on in the background while cleaning your house or masturbating to save the time of sex are not signs of being an unvirtuous person. The key is to not allow sin to capture your heart and pull you from the righteous path to worship sin. For example, treating sex as a sacred act. Do not be seduced by those who would worship the flesh. Outside of the chemical bonding facilitated by it and any efficiency gains from a mood and self-perception boost, marital sex that cannot produce children is just using your partner's body and time for masturbation. Non-reproductive sex is a fetish, where fetish is defined as a misfiring or circumvention of arousal pathways to receive pleasure from them in an act that will not lead to their intended function. The Bible makes it clear on multiple occasions the body is a vessel for what is sacred, and any divinity the body has is only a result of what it carries. What about man being made in God's image? Well, it explicitly does not say that man's body was made in God's image. And let's be serious, do people actually think that God is some giant naked human floating in the ether?
Reports from all over the country have been coming in about what appears to be a giant naked man over the continental United States.
Well, the eyes aren't twinkling and the dimples aren't merry, but I'm standing under a nose like a 70-mile cherry.
We've got feet here on the West Coast, Bill. Giant feet, even relative to the giant man's size.
The human body and its functions are in no way sacred in and of themselves. Those who claim it is are but a step from the Satan worshiper who holds their services using a naked woman as their podium. That said, the naked human form is not inherently sinful either. It is a tool, a vessel, and no more worthy of veneration or fear among the righteous than animated clay. For now, it is also the only vessel we get, and for that reason, our own bodies must be treated with an amount of restraint and respect. This is why any activity that puts your body at risk for the sake of masturbating some emotional state is extremely sinful. Here I am speaking of activities like free climbing, crew, cheerleading, kickboxing, etc. So any activity where you are putting your life at risk, like your body's wholeness and function at risk in order to masturbate some emotional subset, like free climbing is probably the best example of this, is extremely sinful, much more sinful than something like non-reproductive sex. And many people will be like, oh, but doesn't the Bible say that like when you come together and then you're one person and that's a divine thing to do? And it's like, yes, but you're not one person when you have sex. You're one person when you create a child through the act of sex. Two people having sex, like God isn't stupid. He's not like confused, like, oh, my penis touched someone, now we're one person.
No, this makes so much more sense. This definition of one flesh being like literally the one flesh that you create by creating a human. Now I get it. Okay.
Yeah.
Before it was like, well, I don't know. I mean, does that mean that when you hug someone, you're one flesh? Or when a surgeon puts their hand inside you during surgery, you're one flesh? Like none of that really made sense to me.
Yeah, they're like, oh no, it's when you're married that makes the act extra sacred. And I'm like, but like, why?
I also love this idea where people will be like, man was made in the image of God. And they're like, okay, there's like a giant naked dude floating in space, I guess. Like, what? Like, they don't mean like the body. They would have said man's body was made in the image of God. They meant, well, you can tell very much from our belief system. When we say man was made in the image of God, we believe that literally God comes from man eventually. So yes, we are made in the image of God.
So as a reminder for people who haven't watched our other tracks, we think millions upon millions of years from now, mankind eventually becomes the entity which is recognized as God in the Bible and is being influenced to become that entity by this God who lives within the future. But if you actually read the part where it says that man was created in the image of God, this line takes on a new meaning when you're interpreting it through this lens. God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So while the Hebrew word used here, bara, is used to represent a completed action, it is not strictly a past tense word. It can also be used to describe a future action that is certain to occur. Prophetic perfect action, you could call it. So it can actually grammatically correctly be read to mean God is in the process of creating man in his own image.
But I always found this idea of like a giant naked dude in space really weird. I mean, does he have clothes?
Naked dude in space. Yeah.
Well, I mean,
no, it's true.
This is again where I differentiate like a secular perspective versus a non-secular perspective, where I would say, what do people mean when you say you have like a secular theology? And I mean, like, well, we believe that God like literally exists. And they're like, well, like, I believe he literally exists. And it's like, well, I mean, you believe he exists in like a different type of reality than our reality. You don't believe that there is a literal God somewhere in this universe, whereas we believe there is a literal God somewhere in this universe, and he is in the future. But anyway, I'll keep going from here. And I do think that religion should be, especially modern religions, need to be much more strict when it comes to things that can damage your body for no reason other than masturbatory. And this is really where it comes to like this consequentialist framing, right? Where it's like, well, I mean, you might be over-focused on masturbation and under-focused on free climbing, which is going to, for the sake of masturbating some emotional pathway within your body, be more deleterious to your ability to live out the life plan that you're supposed to be living out. Like, anyway, I'll continue. All this comes with a huge caveat. While non-reproductive sex with your spouse is just a form of mutual masturbation, sex does help us chemically bond with our spouses, and many people require some amount of it to feel satisfied. As Christians, our highest duty after our children and God is our spouse, to ensure that they maximize their potential, ensure that they are as sexually satisfied as we can make them with the minimum amount of daily time investment is part of that duty. In this task, it is our duty to, without judgment, learn as much about our spouse's unique sexual profile and dedicate our actions to maximizing its fulfillment. So yes, a wife does have a conjugal duty, but this duty extends far past simple sex and is not limited to the woman. It extends both ways. Both the husband and the wife have a duty to their partner to give them the best life they can and fulfill the sinful desires the partner chooses not to suppress. Here, I would note that those sinful desires may not be sex, but might be something like jewelry or indulgent travel.
Absolutely.
You are not living for God if you live a life where the satisfaction of your partner is not chief among your concerns. Your life is part of a LARP to satisfy your partner's deepest fantasies. However, this duty towards ensuring your partner is satisfied never supersedes your duty to ensure their continued self-improvement in industry. So here, what I'm saying is in relation to your partner, the highest duty is ensuring that they continue to improve to become a better version of themselves. But under that duty, you have I'd say like a moral obligation to masturbate specifically what is needed for them to feel satisfied with their lives. And that may not be through non-reproductive sexual encounters with you and them. It may be through buying them fancy clothes, which is a sinful act. It may be through going to sports tournaments with them or playing video games with them or all of these things. It's just important that you understand that you not attempt to sanctify the sinful acts, that you not attempt to say, well, I'm doing it with my wife. Well, what you're saying is, I have a duty to give them the best life possible while ensuring they spend the lowest amount of time on this stuff. But if you, for example, started to get addicted to something and it started to prevent you from spending as much time on industrial activities as we would want, or industrialist activities, I would also have an obligation to lead you away from that, to let you know and work to lead you away from that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I don't think that there's really anything sort of off limits in a marriage. It's just don't sanctify it. And not only is nothing off limits, but you have a bit of a duty to learn what your partner wants, because you might be able to, for example, sexually satisfy them in using far less time and make them far more satisfied by doing something outside of normal sexual mores.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that? Or
no, it just with your Tract stuff, I think my problem is that it just is so intuitive to me that I'm just like, yeah, okay, absolutely. That's how it is.
Yeah.
Because it is.
And this drive towards efficiency is also how you should relate to sin in your own life. Does music help you work more efficiently? Does masturbation clear your mind before a meeting or a date? Does indulging in watching sports every now and then help you stay motivated during a boring work week? That is for you to judge. We used to live in a world of simple rules, but now you are burdened with making these judgments yourself and being honest about them. When making these judgments, it is crucial to not make the mistake of assuming a sin's severity in the eyes of God is in any way modulated by how severely it is judged by our society. In fact, it is those sins which cannot be used for positive social signaling that are less severe than those which society sees as a sign of status, as they become amplified by pride and vanity. Worse, they are much more likely to blind you to their sinful nature because those around you will affirm you for engaging in them, leading you to spend time, resources, and other proximants for industry on them. It is for this reason that something like watching a pervy anime or reading a /fanfic is magnitudes less sinful and less dangerous than enjoying a night watching a symphony or reading classical literature for entertainment.
The pain purifies my predilection for pleasure.
Your alliteration sounds dangerously like poetry.
My apologies. Strike me silence.
But yeah, do you have any thoughts on that?
I love that, and I love emphasizing that, because I think most religions evolved in an era in which people lived in religious communities, meaning that if the community wasn't okay with it, it was probably not okay per the religion. Now we live in a largely secular society, or in a very heterogeneous religious mix, at least in the United States and many open to immigration cultures. I mean, even Japan has seen record levels of immigration in the past few years. So,
yeah.
Right. Meaning that you can no longer rely on society to be a good litmus test for alignment with your values. And I totally agree that even to the extent that TikTok is a weapon of China, right? To a great extent.
Yeah.
A lot of the things that are being celebrated are quite literally meant to hurt and destroy us.
That they can use these old systems, like don't engage with TikTok with their kids. But then what happens? The kid leaves the house, he engages with TikTok, and it's over, right?
Yeah.
You need to train
And TikTok is the basilisk. It is so perfect.
Yeah, you need to train them in the spiritual discipline to resist a temptation like TikTok.
Yeah. So we're not in ban TikTok team. We're in the...
Well, I actually am from a geopolitical perspective. I think it's bad that we're allowing China to use this to dumb down our population.
It's not fair, but I don't know. Like religiously, we're not against it.
Yeah, religiously, I'm not against it. But I think there's a big difference between our own citizens like going out and engaging with some sinful activity like, music or something like that, and a foreign power intentionally putting music into our communities that is all about like gang violence. Mm-hmm. I'm like, okay, that's, clearly they're trying to mess us up, right? But anyway, back to this. But again, and this is the single most important thing to be vigilant of, never confuse a sin with a virtue, or even worse, with an aspect of your identity. It is okay to exercise a little more than you need to for health purposes because you want to look good or get really into the lore of one of your favorite video games. But don't confuse this with a virtue, or even worse, attempt to sort yourself above others based on a sin. Mm-hmm. So What do I mean by sort yourself above others based on a sin? That means that you are using a sinful activity for social hierarchy signaling. And this is very important that you never, ever, ever do this. And with our kids, this will be one of the things that I emphasize the most to them. So if something was done for indulgent purposes, like not for health, like you are way buffer than you need to be for health reasons or for attracting a mate reasons, then you are using that to social signal within that community, and that's a sin. Or you spend a lot of time learning about the lore of a game or obscure music artists, and you try to use that to, within communities that are dedicated to these things, signal superiority to another person. That is an incredibly sinful thing to do, because you are sorting your identity, like you are building the sin into your identity and sense of self-worth.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you see people do that. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, but this is very related to getting caught up in the governance trap of dominance hierarchies within any insulated social group, right? So I think it's very easy when you're in an insulated social group, be it like a forum or your office or your D&D group, whatever it might be, to start to just think that more equals better, because in that dominance hierarchy battle it is, but that's not the same as your values and virtues.
About having a mandate around this is it will make you a much more pleasant person to be around.
Yeah.
Nobody likes the people that do this.
Oh no, yeah, who's like, well, I did this, and who's always trying to one up you. Yeah, no one likes that person. No one wants to be around that person.
Yeah, so just don't, it's okay to know, like, for example, you might be really into like gun stuff, right? And there are two ways you can engage with somebody who knows less than you. One way is designed to assert your dominance, and the other way is to enjoy the hobby with them because they mutually care about the same thing you mutually care about. And all of us have interacted with people in these two camps, and I think that you have a religious mandate, not just that it's preferable, not just that it's good, but you have a religious mandate to not glorify the sin.
Yeah.
And just enjoy what you enjoy with your friends. Okay. Now, it is not to say that we lower the status of sin in things designed to masturbate human arousal pathways without producing their intended outcome, a child. It is just to say that we also see the sin in things designed to masturbate the other types of emotional and arousal pathways in humans without producing their intended outcomes either, like theater, music, art, and sports. Puritans have always been known for engaging more with their sexuality and sexual topics than other groups, as we see in Albion Seeds for British folkways in America. Many of their writings had to be heavily censored until the 21st century. This can seem very confusing to outside groups, given how strict they are about sin. The reason for this apparent paradox is we simply see the truth. Sins associated with sexuality are not worse or a different category than our other sins. And in this new world, drowning in lasciviousness, we must learn to breathe temptation without succumbing to it. Finally, it is critical to remember that you have significant influence over the emotional state you present to other people, and you are responsible for that state. To lower the efficacy of those around you, particularly loved ones, by allowing yourself to enter a negative mood is a fairly severe sin. Happiness, high energy, and an upbeat mood are not just a choice, they are a responsibility and a duty to every parent who has asked their child to stop crying, but then acts as if their own emotional state is totally out of their control. Are you lesser than a toddler? This is something I see all the time. Adults are like, I can't help it. It's just, I feel this way. And then they're like, shut up, stop crying. Like, well, do you not have the ability to do that? And it's like, why do you want them to stop crying? Because it's not efficient. It's not helping the family, right? I don't get mad at my kid for crying when they're like genuinely hurt and need to alert me. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
There are no caveats or special exceptions to this expectation of us, especially as we relate to those counting on us to be their foundation, like our children and spouses, except, of course, where emotional displays could be used to motivate another person to help you towards God's plan. Your parents died? How does crying bring them back? It just hurts the living family. You lost your job? Is crying going to get you a new one? Crying and sadness are emotions we evolve to signal to parents that we are distressed before we are verbal. They are vestigial in adults, but you will look foolish. Fine, then look foolish and own how you are different from this sad and dying world. When people look towards Techno-Puritans, they should see an unflappable
vision of the future of humanity, and gratitude for the gifts of our lives. And here what I mean, you know, when I didn't put up a big fuss about my mom dying, because we had an author who was writing a book on genius who was like living with us at the time, he was really surprised and kind of like, what? And you can watch our episode on like, we have a weird relation to death in this society. But I was like, how does it help? How does it help my family? How does it help my kids? Like, do my kids need to see me crying about this? Like, will that make them better people? Anyway. Many churches today get people in their door by draping their walls in various forms of man-made vulgarities, literally making sin their primary advertising point, but saying it's okay because it's sin about Jesus. It sickens me when I see mega churches ban their kids from listening to secular rock, but then love when those same kids listen to Christian rock. Christian rock might as well be abortions for Christ. We need to get back to owning our sin. When sin and idolatry become the primary advertising mechanism of your church, then the church becoming a den of sin is the inevitable result. Is it any wonder that so many megachurch founders cheat old people out of their savings through promises of salvation, or that indulgent St. Peter's Basilica, meant to seduce people into a state of simulated piety, was bought and funded with indulgences? The parishioners you lure by making your worship sexier corrupt the souls of your leaders. Jesus said we will know them by their fruit. And yet many feel they can sweep the evangelical and Catholic sex scandals and systemic cover-up under the rug. You will know them by their fruit is not an idle statement. Don't attempt to revive your traditions by sexing up your worship, returning to nature worship, or worse, worshiping human flesh. Return to the simple pragmatic tradition of work, discipline, austerity, and industry.
I see. Roses are red, violets are blue. Both are useless. Plant some wheat.
The best ministry a belief system can have is to be the type that creates the kind of people who, when people first see them, they laugh at you because of how different you are. Then keep watching you, because you make them feel good. Then begin to become envious of you and realize it is something they want. The last Puritan movement ultimately fell because it became a virtue spiral around signaling sobriety and somberness. And yet that was not even the most efficacious emotion to signal. We will learn from the mistakes of our ancestors and build the city on a hill that is mankind's manifest destiny. And by the way, I said here, and I'd love a fan to draw this because I want to have this there. I've tried to get AI to draw it, but I can't. So we'll see if I can, which is to have Joy in Inside Out just be like a fascist dictator of the brain. I think that that's the way it's supposed to look. It's interesting that in Inside Out, they don't have like a logic thing, but you need a partnership. Logic and Joy as a married couple who are fascist dictators of your brain household. Everyone else is a child and does what the husband and wife, Logic and Joy, tell them to do.
That sounds ideal.
The fact that the last time people tried to create a movement like this, the last Puritan revival, was killed by virtue spirals tied to somberness and seriousness that aren't even, again, as we've said, particularly efficacious. It has been important from us from the very name that we chose, Techno-Puritan, to instill the tradition with an element of lighthearted goofiness and non-seriousness, because that is the best defense against another similar virtue spiral. So in this effort, we frame things like somberness as a sin, being overly serious as a sin, and instead would encourage individuals to do everything they can to foster and kindle a light heart. Because when an individual, and I'm not saying I've achieved this state at all, but when an individual achieves a state of pridelessness, and let's talk about what pride means in this context. Pride isn't knowing or not knowing you're better than somebody or believing yourself to be better than someone. That's a question of truth. Pride stems from a desire to signal that to both them and to yourself for non-efficacious reasons. Now, there's efficacious reasons to signal to somebody, for example, I am an expert in Y subject, therefore you should listen to me when I'm talking about Y subject. That's not pride. Pride is when you are signaling to them something that you think gives you status as a form of masturbating this feeling of I am better than you. And when you are able to genuinely let go of that entirely, two things happen. First, achieving a state of true lightheartedness becomes much easier. And the second is that when you have no pride, nothing can offend you anymore because you have no insecurity. So this isn't to be a person without things to be proud of. It's that you don't care about signaling those things to other people.
But yeah, I mean, do you have any thoughts on this?
I like it. It's just straightforward. And I think the overarching theme in all of this is look at the results, look at the outcome, not at the act.
Yeah.
That's it. Just be hyper focused on, are you achieving the outcomes that matter to your objective function or your values?
So after I recorded this tract, I shared it with one of my Jewish theology nerd friends, and I was like, okay, like how offensive theologically are these concepts that I'm bringing up here? And he responds, oh, actually, Maimonides had a very similar idea, and here it is, which would make it, because Maimonides is very well respected among Jewish theological circles, which would make it very non-offensive from a Jewish perspective, which I was grateful for. But I want to go into Maimonides' ideas here as sort of an afterthought to this tract, as well as where I disagree and agree with Maimonides, as well as a few just points to get into that I thought about in terms of reactions people may have as they're going through the tract. So first is one of the pushbacks somebody may have from the tract, as they would say, well, actually, the sin transference ritual did work, but it only works for little sins and not big sins, and that's why the Israelites weren't allowed in the Promised Land, even though they performed the sin transference ritual. And then the unfortunate response to this is, when you're contrasting between little and big sins, you put God telling you, hey, go kill that country full of people, and you being like, hey, I've got some thoughts on that. You know, one, they do look like they outnumber us extremely. And two, you know, it is a country of people. Maybe mass murder and turning it down isn't in the category of absolutely unforgivable sins. The second one is somebody will, you know, they'll read one of our tracts and they'll be like, oh, no, here, look, it says, here's one of the rules that God gave us in the Bible, and your teachings go against this particular rule. And again, this is where it's very important to move from the deontological to consequentialist framing of the purpose of these rules and why they were there at the time. Because here, you know, you are looking at things like rules around slavery. You know, I could point to those rules and be like, what? So, you know, God wants us to do this with our slaves, right? These rules were for a different time and cultural framing. And what's expected of us is to use the intelligence God has gifted us with to interpret what he meant by them in that context. Also, before I get into Maimonides, I'd point out that when you interpret the story of the tabernacle the way that I have, it makes a lot more thematic sense when you're considering it alongside the various other stories from the wilderness period, where I believe that what is trying to be conveyed and discussed in this section of the Bible is the period where the Jewish people were transitioning between more polytheistic religions and the monotheistic religion that they came to adapt, and the constant backsliding that was part of that process that you see in things like the story of the golden cow. Essentially, I'm arguing that what the Jewish people were doing during this period was they were pulling something of a Benny from the Mummy. They were trying different gods and seeing which ones worked and being punished when they were worshiping the wrong ones, to incrementally move them towards a truer understanding of the real God. And yes, I am very confident in my stance that the God of blood magic and animal sacrifice and gold and gemstones and all of that hookum is not the real God or a benevolent entity. And I would also say here is that in some places when this sin transference ritual is talked about, it's specifically talked about as a ritual that is being done for a different deity named Azazel, a demon or a fallen angel, depending on which interpretation you're looking at. Some Jewish interpretations have tried to argue that Azazel is the name of a cliff, and so it wasn't actually a different god that this ritual was being done for. But the problem is, in context, it's very clearly not a cliff. So you can look at it here. And Aaron shall cast lots over the two goats, one for the Lord and the other lot for Azazel. How is that a cliff? It's being contrasted with one's going to God and the other is going to a cliff. No, this is like a parallel entity to God that's being discussed here. It's very clearly a specific other entity.
Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book.
Most scholars see Azazel as a demon. In the text, Yahweh and Azazel are paralleled. A goat is given to each of them. Since the name Yahweh is used here and is paralleled with Azazel, many see Azazel as a name as well, rather than a generic term like scapegoat. The wilderness, the place where Azazel clearly resides in the text, was a place associated with malevolent supernatural forces in Israel and the wider ancient world. Jewish interpreters and writers also understand Azazel as a demon, or at least a malevolent supernatural personality. In Second Temple literature, like 1st Enoch, Azazel appears as not just any demon, but a chief of demons. Some have even suggested the name means something like fierce god or angry god, and no one's quite sure what the name Azazel actually means, so other suggestions include mighty one of El is strong, or even mighty goat. Okay, so some of that needs unpacking. First, let's look at the wilderness as a place of demons. The scholar Chaim Tawil surveyed Mesopotamian literature and showed that in Mesopotamian demonological texts, malevolent spirits were believed to come up from the underworld through fissures and cracks in the earth. And once they had entered our world, they most frequently lived in the steppe land, or the desert, which is often called the wilderness in the Hebrew Bible. Mesopotamian incantations and magical texts tell magical practitioners and exorcists how to drive demons out of human environments and back to the desert where they belong. Tawil demonstrates that the language of Leviticus 16 and even the later texts that discuss Azazel, like 1st Enoch, are influenced by the language of Mesopotamian demonological and exorcism texts. In 1st Enoch, Azazel is something like the commander of Satan's armies, or maybe even equated with Satan himself. In one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Azazel is the leader of the angels that sinned in Genesis 6, that weird story about the sons of man who sinned with human women and made the Nephilim. That story is incredibly important for the development of Judeo-Christian ideas about angels and demons, and it features prominently in Second Temple literature about the subject. But for now, all we'll say is that by this period, Azazel was thought to be the leader of the group of Watchers in Genesis. All this evidence together is why most scholars see Azazel in Leviticus 16 as a personal name of a supernatural entity that resided in the desert. This figure is opposed to Yahweh, and earlier interpreters understood Azazel to be not only a demon, but a leader among demons.
Or look for the other places Azazel entity is mentioned, where it says, "And Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell for the Lord, and use it as a sin offering, but the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement over it, that it may be sent away into the wilderness to Azazel." So what, the goat itself is leaping off a cliff? No, they'd say, like, the ones who take the cliff interpretation are like, well, then you would take it to the cliff and then push it off the cliff. But that's not what's being talked about here. Like, if it wanted you to take it to a cliff, it would have said a cliff. It doesn't say a cliff. It says to Azazel, which appears to be a different deity. And it also explicitly says that the goat is being offered to this entity. I think in both the text and to many modern scholars of the text, that Azazel, who the goat was being sacrificed to in the sin transference ritual, was either a polytheistic entity of a different religion. Specifically, it may have been the Canaanite deity tied to plague and war, or he may have been a combination of two names, Uzzah and Aziel, two fallen angels mentioned in the Babylonian Talmud. It could be Azel, one of the fallen angels mentioned in the book of Enoch. It could be Azioth, an Arab god associated with the morning star worshipped in Syria. It could be Az, a demon in Zoroastrian mythology associated with greed and lust. Or it could be Thuraim, goat demons mentioned in the Hebrew Bible and that are often associated with Azazel in some traditions. Now, who do I think Azazel is? I think it's pretty clear when I read the Bible who Azazel was. Azazel was the deity that elsewhere in the Bible is spoken of as Asherah. The names sound very similar to each other. Asherah, for those who don't know, when the temple was being cleared out of polytheistic, ritualistic implements, the two gods that were specifically named as having worship of them still happening in the Holy of Holies, the temple in Jerusalem, were the gods Baal and Asherah. What I'm pointing out here is we know that worship to the god Asherah was performed alongside worship of the god Yahweh for hundreds and hundreds of years. So it would make perfect sense that it would be included in this early ritual. And it would make perfect sense that the name would change a little bit over those hundreds of years. So I'm not particularly, or maybe it was a local variant, or maybe it was a, we don't know. But the names are very similar to me. It seems to be the same entity.
This ritual is actually known in other forms in the ancient world. Texts from the site of Ebla in Syria, dating back to the 24th century, or over 4,000 years ago, describe a similar ritual, though there are important differences. The Greeks practiced a similar scapegoat ritual, and these were a kind of elimination ritual, wherein something that causes contamination or pollution, like sin, is transferred onto the goat in order to physically remove it from the community. Scholars have theorized that this kind of scapegoat elimination ritual originated in southern Anatolia or northern Syria and spread from there to Greece and Israel, among other places. Now, this would explain why similar rituals appear in very different places with very different religious traditions.
But you're like, okay, well, then who is this Asherah character? Asherah was the Canaanite goddess that was known as the consort of Baal. So this was even recorded in the Bible, a demonic ritual. So the questions can be, well, if it's recorded in the Bible that it's a demonic ritual, sin transference, why do people treat it so positively? And there's different interpretations here. I'll give one from a contemporary Jewish scholar called Milgram, who argues that the Torah's mention of a semi-divine being and the association of that being with the ritual death of an animal do not actually cause a theological problem because, quote, Azazel himself is deprived of an active role. He neither receives the goat nor acts on it, regardless of his origins. In pre-Israelite practice, he surely was a true demon, perhaps a satyr. And here he's looking at Ezra on 1:6-8, who ruled in the wilderness. In the priestly ritual, he is no longer a personality, but just a name designating the place to which impurities and sins are banished. As for the survival of the name Azazel, demons often survive as figures of speech, e.g. gremlins, long after they have ceased to be figures of belief, end quote. Now, I look at this, and this is, I read this so that you know that many modern biblical scholars and modern Jewish scholars are like, oh yeah, obviously Azazel was a demon or a different polytheistic entity, but the ritual was okay because we're giving the sacrifice to the demon, to Azazel, who himself is one of God's servants, and therefore it's like we're giving the sacrifice to God. Whereas I think the much easier interpretation of all of this is just to say, oh, this is a demonic ritual that is from an older tradition and we're not supposed to be performing it, and it is meant as a warning of the type of thing we are not supposed to do. And as an example of what demonic rituals or Canaanite or Baalite or Azazel worship looks like. Now to Maimonides. Specifically, the sections of Maimonides that we're going to be referencing here is Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, 3:29-31. So first, I'm going to start with a quick summary of what Maimonides appears to have thought God did. Maimonides thought that God took an early polytheistic people and gradually, because they couldn't quickly shift their belief practices to the true belief practices, gradually helped them move to truer and truer practices while allowing them to worship him through their polytheistic rituals by changing sort of the names and intentions of the polytheistic rituals to focus on himself rather than the polytheistic God, with the belief that eventually they would come to just wholly worship him. Now, to give exact quotes here, for a sudden transition from one opposite to another is impossible, and therefore man, according to his nature, is not capable of abandoning suddenly all to which he is accustomed. As therefore God sent Moses, our master, to make out of us a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, through the knowledge of him may he be exalted according to what he has explained, saying, unto thee it was shown that thou mightest know, and so on. Know to this day and lay it on thy heart, and so on, so that we should devote ourselves to him shall ye serve. And at that time the way of life generally accepted and customary in the whole world, and the universal service upon which we were brought up, consisted in offering various species of living beings in the temples in which images were set up, in worshipping the latter, and in burning incense before them. The pious ones and the ascetics being at the time, as we have explained, the people who were devoted to the service of his temples consecrated to the stars, his wisdom may he be exalted, and his gracious ruse, which is manifest in regards to all his creatures, did not require that he give us a law prescribing the rejection, abandonment, and abolition of these types of worship. For one could not then conceive the acceptance of such a law, considering the nature of man, which always likes that I too, which it is accustomed, and at the time this would have been similar to the appearance of a prophet in these times, who, calling upon the people worship God, would say, quote, God has given you a law forbidding you to pray to him, to fast, to call upon him, to help in misfortune. Your worship should consist solely in meditation without any works at all, end quote. Therefore he may be exalted, and suffered the above-mentioned kinds of worship to remain, but transferred them from created or imaginary and unreal things to his own name, may he be exalted, commanding us to practice them with regards to him, may he be exalted. All right, so essentially he's arguing that all of this was a ruse by God, and it was a ruse by God in the same way that somebody, I guess kind of like I have, couldn't come down and be like, well, I mean, actually God doesn't want you doing this sorts of like worship that right now you're doing in cathedrals and temples. That is not worship to the true God. That's, you know, tinged with older polytheistic stuff. And he's right about that. It is a hard message to swallow. I just take a much harder stance than him, and I think that by now, you know, 2,000 years later, God expects us to get the message at this point and have advanced enough. So while I see the logic in his perspective, the reason why I am so hostile to it is that if it had been the perspective that was held during the Josiah reforms, they wouldn't have removed the statues to Baal and Asherah from the temple. They would have said, well, you know, God's allowing us to worship him through these, and some of the people need it, and you can't change too quickly. No, we need to always be attempting to purify our beliefs and look for the improprieties and imperfections that came from the mistakes of our ancestors. Now, if I continue with this quote, he gets even more specific here. Quote, through this divine ruse, it came about that the memory of idolatry was effaced, and that the grandest and truest foundation of our belief, namely the existence and oneness of the deity, was firmly established, while at the same time the souls had no feeling of repugnance and were not repelled because of the abolition of modes of worship to which they were accustomed, and than which no other mode of worship was known at the time. Basically saying, well, we didn't know another way to worship to God at the time, and so we were using these polytheistic practices. So basically Maimonides sees these rituals being done, and his take on it is, yes, these are polytheistic rituals in the same way that I think that they're polytheistic rituals, but that God had sanctified them and transformed their meaning to be focused on himself. Whereas I do not believe that. I believe that these are purely demonic rituals. These were not sanctified by God, and I see as proof that they were not sanctified by God through the fact that, one, defenseless animals were being tortured, and two, they didn't work. The sin transference ritual didn't work. It's still recorded in the Bible that this ritual is a ritual done for demons, for Satan. That is what sin transference is. And obviously this isn't gonna, you know, Jews are like, oh my gosh, how dare he say this? Consider this doesn't sit well with mainstream interpretations of Christianity either, if I am right about this. And it's a much stronger and harder stance than Maimonides, rather than saying that, oh, well, this was just a period of transfer over. Instead, what I see as the foundation of the Jewish tradition, and later the Christian and Muslim traditions, as not being a holistically pure monotheistic foundation, but instead the intertwining of a predominantly Canaanite religious polytheistic system and the, i.e. Baalite worship, as I call it, and the true monotheistic practice. One practice representing a form of true evil and the other practice representing true monotheism and a form of true good. And that we are, you know, like in the Josiah reforms, and in a way through the fact that the Josiah reforms are recorded, commanded to always be vigilant and on the hunt within Scripture, within our traditional teachings, for these demonic teachings. And the demonic teachings aren't there by accident. They're there for a reason. They're there to teach us things. For example, this one is there to teach us what a demonic ritual looks like and how to avoid it. And it's very clearly marked to us as a demonic ritual because, well, the Bible says it's being done for the demon Azazel, basically, and because it doesn't work, and because it involves animal sacrifice, and because it involves idolatry, and because it involves the worship of earthly metals, and, you know, a lot of reasons. It's pretty clearly, to me, marked as demonic. But it's not an accident that it's there. You just need to, you know, be actually paying attention when you're reading. Oh, it says this is a ritual done for demons. Okay, let's not do that ritual. Let's not have Jesus be a stand-in for that ritual. A note, I was talking about this with one of my friends, and he was like, wait, so do you not believe that Jesus was the Son of God who martyred himself, you know, to save mankind? And I was like, no, of course I believe that. It's just that all of those words mean something different to me. I believe that Jesus was a representation of what's expected of us as humans in our moments of martyrdom, which is to say that we are the Son of God and that we will eventually, through intergenerational martyrdom, alleviate the deficiencies or sins of mankind and allow mankind to elevate itself to the point where it can rejoin God. But what I definitely don't believe is that Jesus, the Son of God, was sacrificed to Satan to save man from his sin. No, that seems wrong to me, because we know from the Bible that sin transference, the only place we find it happening is when the sin transference is being sent to Azazel. It's never sent to God. There is no sin transference ritual for God. And why would there be? It's so obviously an immoral thing to attempt to do. And consider what it means if you take this other interpretation. We know from the line, my Lord, why have you forsaken me?" that Jesus would have been a non-voluntary sacrifice. I love that many Christians pretend he was a voluntary sacrifice when we know, no, this was a non-voluntary sacrifice. So what, we took a guy, like the one sinless guy, and then God had him involuntarily sacrificed for your sins? That's effed up. That is like, if you're like, that's the God I worship, I'm like, that sounds like a malevolent entity to me. And I can see why sin transference was done for Azazel and why the Bible clearly marks that for us so we don't make this mistake. Now, if you want to get really deep here, we're going to go into a different famous Jewish scholar. This is a man called Maimonides or Ramban. He was a prominent Jewish scholar, rabbi, a philosopher, and physician who lived in the 13th century. So again, prominent figures here. I'm really going into this so people are like, your ideas are not anti-Semitic. I don't want to get called like, because some people could say that this is a pretty anti-Semitic take, that these rituals, which are key to early Jewish history, were in fact polytheistic rituals. So what does he say about these rituals, right? Does he also agree with me? So he says, quote, "This is the secret of the matter. They used to worship gods, which are the angels making offerings to them, which were pleasing aroma to them, as it is said," basically ... He reads a line from the Bible here. "And you need to contemplate the verse and the text in the tradition." Then ... "The intention of the scapegoat is not that it should be an offering from us to him," Azazel, "God forbid, but that our intention should be to do the will of our Creator who commanded us. The analogy for this is like one who made a feast for our Lord, and the Lord commanded the one making the feast, give one portion to my servant as so-and-so. The one making the feast is not giving anything to that servant, nor is he doing it in his honor, but everything is given to the Lord, and the Lord gives a reward to his servant. This one kept his commandment and did for the honor of the Lord all that he commanded him. Indeed, the Lord, in his compassion for the one making the feast, wanted all his servants to benefit from it, so that he would speak of him favorably and not unfavorably. This is the reason for the lots. For if the priest had sanctified them verbally to the Lord and to Azazel, it would have been like worshiping him and vowing in his name. But he would place them before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of the meeting, for both are a gift to the Lord. And he gave from them to his servant the portion that would come from him for the Lord. He cast lots for them, and his hands divided them, as it is said, quote, this lot is cast into the lap, but the whole disposing thereof, the Lord, end quote. Even after the lot, he would place it before the Lord and say it is his, and we do not intend in sending it except for the will of his name, as it is said in verse 10, quote, but the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be set alive before the Lord to make atonement over him, to send him away, etc., end quote. Therefore, we do not slaughter it at all. Oncles translated, quote, the name of the Lord and to Azazel, end quote, for one is the name of the Lord and not to him. The second is to Azazel and not the name of Azazel. So basically, he's arguing here in a way that is really, really Jewish in argument and isn't going to make sense to most Christians, which is to say he's arguing in very, very specific technicalities, which is a unique part of the Jewish faith, I have found. Catholics do this too sometimes, Orthodox do this too, but you don't see this as much in the low church faith versus the high church versions of Christianity. Like most of the Protestant groups don't do this. And this that I'm talking about is he's like, well, God got out of having us sacrifice the goat to a demon using a technicality in the way he was choosing the goat and the way that he was doing the wording. And with low church stuff, you just don't really believe in technicalities. Like, why would the God of reality need to work in like IRS style technicalities to get us out of worshiping demons? He could have just told us, don't worship the demon, right? What is the more logical interpretation of this story? Oh, we actually are supposed to be worshiping a demon, but, you know, we're actually worshiping God through the demon, and there's all sorts of technicalities to prevent us from accidentally worshiping the demon. When I talk about Jews and technicality, I mean, I think nothing better shows this Jewish technicality thing than that the line that they spend like $1 million a year to keep up around New York. It's this little line that goes around the city, and it's used so that all of the city counts as one place on the Sabbath, because otherwise, and I'm probably misexplaining this a little bit, but Jews can explain it better. But basically, if you're an Orthodox Jew, taking items from one location to another location can count as labor, which can make it very hard to live during the Sabbath. So some Jews believe that you can get around this by putting up these lines, and everything within one of these lines is technically considered the same place, so you can go and move things more broadly during the Sabbath because of this. And then there's me, you know, a Protestant who's like, I'm pretty sure God doesn't care about the fishing line. I'm pretty sure that God is interested in more sort of consequentialist outcomes than very specific, oh, we had sex through a hole in the sheet, so therefore it doesn't count. So I'm pretty sure that when God was like, hey, rest on the Sabbath, what he meant was, hey, don't work every day of the week, you know, maybe take one day off. That seems like a reasonable thing for God to want from us, and a reasonable request that would have improved people's quality of life. And again, I note that not all Jews do this. This is a sub-faction of Jews who go into these weird, really specific arguments, but there is almost no group of Christians who does this in the same way groups of Jews do this, or make these types of arguments. Another thing that Rabbi Eliezer does here, which is really interesting, is, well, quote, and they shall no more sacrifice their sacrifices unto the goat demons. The word is compound, and it has many companions. By the way, he doesn't use the word goat demons. He uses the word serim. The matter is clear, except if you investigate what is the matter of the separate intellects and spirits in the sacrifice, and this is known regarding the spirits in the wisdom of necromancy, and is also known regarding the intellects in the hints of the Torah for one who understands their secret, and I cannot explain. For we would need to muzzle the mouths of those who are wise in nature, who follow the Greek, who deny everything except what is tangible to him, and who, arrogant in his opinion, he and his wicked disciples, thinking that any matter that he did not comprehend with his reasoning is not true. So let's talk about what he's talking about here, because this is really interesting. He's saying that we should actually be looking into these rituals different from the way I look into them. See, I look at these rituals and I see them as very clearly marked as demonic and satanic and just like labeled that way. This is a ritual for a demon. Don't do this stuff. And he looks at them and he goes, no, the reason that they're recorded and they're part of our tradition is not as a warning, but as something that we are supposed to investigate to understand certain types of supernatural phenomenon and forces. Essentially, investigate this thing, which he recognizes is associated with the demonic, or what I would call the demonic, and we can get a better understanding of like the true nature of reality and spirits of the world, where I'm like, no, just if it's demonic, it's bad. Stay away from it. And I'm like, very, very different way to approach things. When I reflect on which am I more comfortable with, like what do I feel like in my heart of hearts is probably right. If the Bible's recording something and it's recording it as demonic, do I think it wants us to like try to investigate it and understand it and empathize with it? Or do I think it wants us to see it as emblematic of the way that people can use even true faith systems like the Christian system and stuff like that to manipulate us into demonic acts and worship? I think the latter, for sure. And do I think that it shows this intertwining of sort of original sin into the Abrahamic tradition? Yes, as well. But it also gives us an easy way to spot and disintermediate this original sin within the Abrahamic tradition. And I note, it's not just here. It's not like I'm just like taking one line and then building a whole idea out of this. You see this across early Jewish literature. So you can look at like the Tractate Gittin 68a and b, which records that when Solomon was building the first temple, he used the help of the king of demons called Asmodeus or Ishmadai, depending on how you say it. Anyway, look, the point being, king of demons helped obtain the instrument that cut the stones that the first temple was built out of. This idea of the very, very early church having an element of the demonic woven into an element of the holy because they were coming out of a polytheistic tradition and they couldn't just snap over like that, to a fully new type of worship, is throughout these early traditions. The final note, because somebody was mentioning this in one of our other comments, and I was like, we should probably clarify our stance in this, which is to say, in Christianity, is salvation achieved through works or through faith alone? And I think that this is a false dichotomy. I think salvation is only achieved through providence. The elect, who is among the elect, is something that is decided by providence. Your actions are determined both by your genetics and the events of your life. There is no independent you that's controlling you other than the things that you have experienced in your life that make up who you are, the thoughts that you've had in the past that were influenced by those things that happened to you, which led to your actions. Also, we don't believe in a persistent individual entity. So by that, what I mean is you cannot offload your sin to another being. I can't force my sin onto an unwilling human sacrifice, okay, or a goat sacrifice. I am always responsible for that sin, and it is only through my own martyrdom that that sin can be alleviated. But the iteration of me that sinned, me when I'm sinning, that time is always lost to humanity. I can't make up for that time being lost. It's always lost. The day that I spent playing video games or watching a sports game or indulging in something else, that's time that I can never get back and I can never recontribute to humanity. And I am holistically lost to being a meaningful contributor to the act of salvation, the act of the uplifting of humanity during that time period. I will never be able to turn the iteration of myself that was indulging in sin into a meaningful iteration of humanity. It's completely gone. However, the iterations of me in the moments where I am being productive in a way that ends up contributing to the grand scheme of humanity, those iterations of martyrdom, those iterations of my individual sacrifice for the betterment of mankind, those iterations are always doing that, and they are truly saved. And this is what we mean when we say something like, your past sin is made irrelevant when you turn to Christ. By that, what I mean is there's nothing you can do about those moments in the past anymore. So there's no need to dwell on them. The only thing you have control over is the things that you do in the future. Therefore, it is a useful mental framing device to see your past sin as being something that is wholly irrelevant.
Both. Finally, I'd note, if you're like, I really like what you guys are doing, I want to donate to something, we are getting the church registered. The Techno-Puritan church is what it's called, right?
Yeah, the Techno-Puritan Federation.
The Techno-Puritan Federation. I love it. Because we were looking at a few other, what was the few other names that it could have been? Jewish Federation of one of the Jewish groups was called the Federation. And I was like, I like that so much more than like congregation or something. The Techno-Puritan Federation.
Young people from all over the globe are joining up to fight for the future.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part too.
But if you want to donate, one of the things that you can do instead of actually, because like, we don't want your money right now, right? It's nice, it helps, but you know, is write us into your will. If you don't have any descendants and you want stuff like our stuff to work out or our goals to work out, that's where the real advantage could be. But obviously only if you do not have any descendants. We are not, this is more of the money is going to the US government. Fine. Other than that, it should go to people who you personally care for.
Yeah. We just noticed that, for example, the Audubon Society, which is right by where we live, is
from wills. So many
it's
old birdwatchers.
Insanely well funded. Yeah, I guess there's a lot of childless bird watchers out there. So they just wrote in the Audubon Society and they're doing well. Oh, it's beautiful. Beautiful. It tracked. It tracked. Oh. Our family is going to have so many inside jokes like that. And I can't wait. I can't wait.
Yeah, I really think that people underestimate, and this was clear to me when we were spending time with the family recently, that when you create a kid, you're creating an adult who's going to live a full life.
Yeah.
You know, because I was around all my cousins who I feel like just, 10 years ago, I saw them and they were little squidges, and now they're all in like college and stuff and dating. And I'm like, oh, you guys are like fully developed human beings that I saw in like 3 slices throughout my life.
When people talk about bringing a new life into the world, it's typically, they use words along the lines of, would you like to have a baby? Should we have a kid? So you're just picturing this low agency, dependent, small being instead of a full human life with the full range of human experiences, who will have an impact on the world, who will feel joy and pain. And
yeah, one of my cousins was trying to convince me to not have a kid. And they were like, well, you already have 4 and you're not going to be able to do things with them that are like big life experiences because, you're having so many. And I was like, yeah, but like, that's another kid that's not going to get to exist. And I should have been like, no, that's like another person, another family member, another cousin
another
of yours.
Adult, yeah.
Who you have denied existence so somebody else can go on more vacations. Like...
But that's, prenatalism is for the superfans. It's for the people who are really into having a lot of kids and want to have a lot of kids and are set up to do that. I don't think prenatalism is for people who want to have small families. So it's not about shaming people for making the decision to choose a non-scalable family model. Prenatalism is just for the people who want to scale, who like the economies of scale that kick in after child number 4.
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to find which number we're on. I think we're on number 9. I'll just trust myself on this.
Okay. Sorry about Hiccups McGee over here. She's going hard.
Never need to apologize for a cute little baby.
You're the cutest. Yeah, you see your dad.
And this one's going to be longer than others, so I will just jump in
Power
pretty quickly.
through, friend. Power through. Just know, Malcolm, that I love you. Because if you're editing this and you're watching this, you are probably finding out. So this is my secret message to you, that while I'm still asleep and you're waking up at 2 a.m. in the morning to put together these episodes, I deeply love you and really appreciate the hard work that you're doing, because I know that it's a lot. And I know you put a lot into making this podcast work, in addition to maintaining your full-time job and everything else that you do. So just know I'm very grateful to you. And I love you and I admire you a lot. You're very special. And your kids are amazing too, which is a testament to you as a parent, because kids are the equivalent to like human versions of a drunk you, right? You can't hide all of your flaws with your children. They show up in your children. And so if your children, especially in their toddler format, turn out to be okay people, it's probably a sign of your quality, both from a genetic and a behavioral standpoint. So also, it is not just my opinion that validates the fact that you are a fantastic and brilliant person. It is the fact that our kids are pretty solid, fantastic people. So thank you, Malcolm. I'm going to stop recording now, but know that I love you.